G'day podcasters, welcome back to Season 6 of True Blue Conversations with your host Adam Bloom, the author of Easy Target, now available at adambloom.com.au. 8 years ago, after returning from 3 tours of Afghanistan and then gaining experience and education in financial planning, Warren Loudon teamed up with fellow veteran Dave Vaughan and started Loudon and Vaughan Private Wealth, founded with the underlying belief that every person matters and every dollar counts, providing comprehensive tailored financial advice and wealth management services for you and your family. Loudon and Vaughan will guide you towards your financial goals with integrity and transparency. Whether you're planning for retirement, investing for the future, or managing your family's wealth, they've got you covered. Visit loudonandvaughan.com.au or call 02 9538 2704 to book a meeting with Warren today.
G'day, welcome back to True Blue. Today I'm coming to you live from Perth, and I've got a very special guest on, and he has a very long and distinguished career in the Australian Army, and he did a lot of time, well, most of his career in the SAS, and he got to the rank of Regimental Sergeant Major, and it is an absolute honour to have him on to share his story. And Wayne Weeks, welcome to the podcast, mate.
Hey, thanks, Adam. And, very much appreciate it, and thanks for the intro. No, look, really appreciate the opportunity to sit here and have a chat, mate. Been looking forward to it for a while.
No, mate, it's great to have you on. So, Wayne, before we get into your career and the distinguished and long career that you had, let's go back to a young Wayne Weeks. And what were you like, as I'm guessing, as most veterans that I've had on, the young rascal, or what was life like as a young fella?
No, mate, I was a goody two-shoes, actually. And I often comment, like a lot of books you read, people came from, unfortunately, broken homes or, rough childhoods and all that sort of stuff. But I grew up in a very loving family, very supportive family, grew up in a country town, so, a little bit wild, I suppose you might want to say. But
I think it has become wild now, hasn't it? A good old Dubbo.
Yeah, Dubbo, yeah. It's become very large, that's for sure. But I think there was about 18 or 19,000 when I grew up there. I think there were over 60 or 70,000 now. But anyway, so, used to get out and about, spending most of my time down the river or out hunting. So doing a lot of that sort of stuff. But yeah, I was a good kid. I don't think I was in too much trouble. Went through to year 12 at school, did okay. Really enjoyed my time there, growing up in that environment. Really enjoyed it.
So did you have any family members that had served in the ADF, or were you the first?
As far as I know, mate, I'm the first. Had a cousin wanted to be in the military, was sort of literally dying to get in the military, but just had some conditions that unfortunately didn't allow him to serve at the time. So he was sort of my one person I'd go to ask him a bit, and I think he got through a few weeks of Kapuka, and unfortunately they wouldn't let him go on. So that was about all I had to go on. So.
Yeah, right. And for you, mate, what drew you to join the Army in 1988? And back then, political correctness wasn't what it is today. And what was the process, because the internet didn't exist? So what was the process back then?
No, mate, I think I sort of got interested. He wasn't my real pop, but I had my nana's boyfriend at the time. He was a World War II veteran. He used to talk about that sort of stuff a lot. Mind you, I love flying. I was in the Air Training Corps, and I got my glider's licence through that. So that was the closest I could get to that sort of thing. And then when I got a little bit older, I started reading a little bit more. Falklands War was around at that time, so I was reading a bit about that, read the books about the SAS, but didn't really know too much about it. But that sort of, I suppose that spiked my interest, and then, I loved the flying piece, but I just wasn't smart enough to be a pilot. Really enjoyed that, loved flying the glider a bit, did a bit more of that after I sort of got out of school, but became very expensive. And then... so then I looked at a few different options, what I wanted to do. I wanted to do something practical, study wasn't sort of on the horizon at that time. So, I joined the Army.
So, for you, did it ever come into your mind to go down the officer's path, or were you always...
No, I actually the first thing I did was the officer selection, not the selection board, sorry. I did the written testing for it.
Yep.
And I got through that okay. But at the time, and it was purely a timing issue, from my age when I did the testing to when I would have done conducted the intake for RMC was a fairly long wait. And I got talked into joining the army in the meantime. So, enjoyed it, mate. Really enjoyed it.
So you get to Kapuka, mate, and what do you remember of, as I said, 1988, political correctness wasn't what it is today. What was that like? Because how old were you when you joined up?
Yeah, 18.
18,
yeah,
so
yes.
Was that a shock and awe when you got to Kapuka?
Yeah, look, man, to me, I don't know whether it was being a country boy or, my old man was very laid back, but I almost saw it as a game, I suppose, and it was just, it was very, very different, but nothing fazed me too much. I remember one of the instances watching one of the young blokes with us, he had his head shaved off, he had dreadlocks, and he had his dreadlocks shaved off, and the poor guy was in tears. And as you said, it was politically incorrect in those days, and everyone was pulling the piss out of this poor guy. And I actually remember feeling fairly sorry for him. But then, when I was getting my head shaved, I thought I just couldn't stop laughing. But look, to me, it was an adventure. A young guy seeing something very different, and then, like I said, there was at that stage in the military, there were still things like blanket bashing. There were still things that throwing everyone's kit out the window, bastardisation. A far cry from what we see today. So look, but you didn't know any different then. So I thought it was a bit of a game. I just went along with the game, and ultimately, the section commanders at the time, they give you a really hard time. That's all they knew at the time. And then, but as you find out as things go along, they're humans as well, and most of them are reasonably decent, peaceful. So they're there to get you through, and it went well. I enjoyed it. So, and
because back then too, was it still the Vietnam era of your secos and that you can remember back in '88, or
not so much from Kapuka when I got over to SASR. Very much so. We had a lot of ex-Vietnam veterans from that era, but at Kapuka, not so much in the platoon I was in. Yeah, hardcore. They came across to me as very professional people.
Yep.
They came across to me as knowing what they were doing, but still, as you said, it took it with a grain of salt. But it was hardcore, some of it. And what was interesting to see, if you were one of those guys that didn't meet the standard, that was hard to watch for some of those guys. And we did lose quite a few on the way. I think I can't remember exact figures, but I thought we started with about 50 odd, and we were down in the 30s, I think, at the end of it. So, it was fairly high attrition rate, interestingly.
Right. And did you have, back then, were you corps allocated, or could you choose your preference of where you wanted to go?
No, you did all your ECN training, unlike now, you did your ECN training while you were there. You didn't really know too much about it. You just sat and did some diagnostics, some paperwork, some psychometric stuff, I'm assuming. And interestingly enough, the only one that I wasn't allowed to do was be a military policeman. So I don't know why, but probably breaking the rules. But that was the only one I couldn't do. And then at the time, because I'd done year 12, funnily enough, one of my electives in year 12 was photography. So one of the guys goes, become a cartographer, making maps and that sort of stuff. And I was like, not really what I joined for. But he swindled me again. He said, it's pay level 6 back in those days, which was the highest pay level you could get. So I went all the way through thinking that's what I was going to do. And then at the end of it, I think week 11 of week 12, or 12 weeks, they said that's no longer available, pick something else. So I wanted to go to infantry. They said they've all been filled. What other options do I have? And the only other option really was, that I thought was something I'd like to do was the signals corps. So ended up in SIGs, and of all their choices, I think that was a pretty good one. But again, really didn't know what I was getting myself into. So you got to ask what you wanted to do depending on how you performed at the time.
So do you march? So you march out of Kapuka, and do you bring your family over to see the march out and proud moment for you?
Yeah, mate, they weren't too far away. I think it's about a 5-hour drive from Dubbo to Wagga. Yeah, so brother, sister, mum, dad, all came over. I think actually a couple of my cousins came over as well. So Yeah, so it's a good day, yeah. Sort of very proud sort of thing to do. My old man never said too much, but I think, through sort of feedback through mum, he was sort of really, really proud to see that day, and everything went really well. I think they enjoyed it.
So you then go. So you go to the School of Six, is that right?
Yeah, down in Watsonia, Melbourne. Yep.
And what was that like for you? Because I know a lot of guys that I've had on, when they go infantry, they go to Singleton. Is that another 3 months that you do your initial employment training, or?
Yeah. So, and at the time, again, you do a bunch of testing when you get there to the school, and then through that aptitude testing, typically depends on where you'll be, what course you will do on your IET, or so your initial enlistment training. And so we did a test for Morse code, we did a typing test, I believe, we did some technical testing, and interestingly enough, the only one I didn't do well in was the Morse code aptitude test. And I think that was more the bloke that was marking my test than anything. But so that was the one I couldn't choose. So I was supposed to go into one of the technical trades. There was no courses running, and they had a rule there. They didn't like you hanging around waiting for a course more than 3 months. And at that stage, I'd been there for a couple of months. And they said, well, that course is not going to run. Pick something else, but there wasn't anything else to pick. Yeah. so I went up, I think it was called the Operation Communication Systems course, or OPCOM SYS they call it, and a lot of it involved typing, mate. So here I was thinking I was going to be a hardened infantry soldier, and I was typing. So, but look, interestingly enough, the methodology of teaching that was something I use today, and it was quite fascinating. And obviously when I look back on it, I thought, well, they were sort of way ahead of the game, but it was really interesting. And I said it was a, you talk about an eye opener of a course. That was one of them. I said, there was 15 or 16. No, actually, there was more than that. I think there was 18 or 19 girls on the course. There's a few blokes, so very female-dominated course, and real eye opener for a young bloke.
So after that, you become a trained signaller after that, and you post into 1526 Squadron.
No, not straight away.
Not straight away.
No, straight away. After the course, I got posted up to 1 Sig Regiment, so up in Enoggera, Brizzy, which was great fun. Again, hadn't really been there before, but spent a couple of good years there. Had a really good mate that I joined with, Mark Burgess. We both posted in together, and then spent a couple of years there first. And again, really good lifestyle, young bloke. Back in those days, earning okay money. It was a requirement to live on the base for the first 12 months back in those days. You didn't get to go out on your own. So once that was done, we sort of moved out into a little rental. So a lot of freedom, did a lot of good exercises, supported a lot of infantry battalions, learned a lot. And then from there, while I was there, I went back to the School of SIGs and did my radio course, the one I wasn't qualified to do. I went and did it, topped that. I was actually a jet at Morse code, which is a bit sad. But, so went and did that course, then came back to Brizzy. And it was sort of at that point I ran into some guys that came from 1526 Squadron, which is the signal squadron that supports the Special Air Service Regiment. And then, ran into those guys, and they were telling me all sorts of stories about what goes on. And, so at some point in there, after a couple of years, I thought that'd be something I'd be interested in doing, for sure. And
back then and throughout your career, you talk about mentors, and did you have some good mentors when you first got to 1 Sig, or...?
Yeah, I took a real shine to one of my sergeants. Again, back in those days, it was fairly hardcore, just stuff you wouldn't get away with these days, just, the way you're spoken to, basically given some orders, which is the army, funnily enough. So, there was one particular, I won't say his full name, but Steve. He was just a very level-headed guy, very objective, and I think I took a lot away from him about how I would approach things. And then I came across, again, one of the 152 guys. Again, I really liked the way he conducted himself, just, again, very professional, no nonsense. But again, he always, one of the things I still carry to this day, and I've seen it in a few people that I've dealt with, but always getting both sides of the story. So, like back in those days, if you got in trouble, it was usually just one way. And it was just, if you were more senior, that was the way it was going. But this guy actually, took the time to go and get both sides of the story and make an objective decision out of that, which I sort of, I still use that sort of methodology to this day, so which is good.
So you mentioned that you were starting to hear 152, and in 1992 you go on or you try out for selection. And you said as a kid that you'd read, about the SAS. Did you have the knowledge, or did you know much about what you're about to go and do when you're prepared to go on selection?
Honestly, not really. As I said, I read some stuff about the SAS and the British Special Boat Service, SBS guys, over in the Falklands, and that sounded really cool. And I thought, but really, as far as how to get there and what to do, no real idea. There was, even back in those days, there was ideas around, okay, if you're going to go and do selection, this is the training process. I suppose I was fortunate in a way that some of the guys that had done selection but hadn't made it were back in the unit, so there was a big call for signallers to go over there at the time. So quite a few went from 1 SIG the year before, but those that didn't pass came back. So, I was sort of listening to them, but unfortunately, because they didn't make it, it was fairly negative rhetoric coming back. So I think I made a conscious decision not to listen to those guys. And then from there, tried to seek out some information. And it's very different now. So if you look at selection now, they will send out all that information that's on their intranet website, like how to train, training programs, what you should be eating, what you should be looking at from a psychological perspective. So most blokes can be fit enough, but they don't have it mentally. But back in those days, I really didn't have a clue, mate. So I followed a really rough training program, and then from there, didn't know that I was doing too much, and I think I absolutely just completely jagged it, because at the start of selection, and when we can talk about it more, the first few days I thought, God, I'm nowhere near ready. But then sort of halfway through, I felt like I was almost peaking. I was actually feeling good. So I think, I didn't know anything about, periodisation in training or anything back in those days, but I think I actually jagged it and I was peaking during it, whereas I watched a lot of my mates were falling away, so they might have overtrained or not trained enough. So, it was quite interesting. But again, didn't know any of this at the time, of course. So.
And as you said, mate, too, that selection has changed so much, and there's a lot more science now. It's science-based now, and from back then it was, and totally different. And comparing selections it's, as you say, you can't compare selections because they're all different.
Yeah, they are, and something as simple as a day of rain you will lose a massive amount of people. Like everyone might be travelling along well, the weather's pretty good, and then you get one day of rain, and people just don't want to deal with that. And again, that's probably more of a mental thing. But yeah, look, the selection piece, the format in reality hasn't changed significantly. I think whoever set that up, and it was built that way for a reason, and it works well from that perspective. But where we've changed it a lot is how we look at it. So the unit has 14 attributes. So on any activity, those activities are aligned with the attributes. So what are you looking for and how are you doing that? You get a much more diverse spread of people looking at you. In the old days, sometimes you were stuck with one DS, and if that DS didn't like you, directing staff, if that directing staff didn't like you, you're pretty much doomed. But now you get, upwards of 30 or 40 different people looking at you and making an assessment on you, but it is so much more controlled. We have a couple of psychologists there that assist with that. We have a very strict protocol about how you are meant to report on people. So, and you can't do the old, I'll throw in a couple of 100 push-ups here if someone stuffs something up anymore. So it's very controlled from that perspective. So it's fair across the board, or fairer across the board. But yeah, a lot of science has gone into that, and how we select the guys and girls, I should say, as well. There's been quite a few females that have attempted selection now, which is great. So yeah, it's a very different beast than it used to be. So, but still similar times. It's always sort of fluctuated between 18 to 21 days. I think in the very, very early days, it could go on as long as they wanted, but for a long time now, it's been between 18 and 21 days. So.
I remember I recently just had Troy Simmons on the podcast, and he said himself, he said that it was different when you were on the other side, when you were going for selection, to then being a directing staff and actually selecting. And he said you could tell the mind games of the DSs play, and he said where you get no feedback, you don't know how you're going, and he said when you're being selected, he said that it's the mind, like it fucks with your mind, as he said. But when it's on the other, when you get to the unit and then it's on the other foot, he said there's a reason we do that.
Yeah, for sure. And so if you go back to my selection in '92, and I remember the instructors really well, that back in those days it was just beasting you. So just continuous barrage of abuse, you know, or you being a lazy, no good, nothing, or you know, what are you doing here? You know, why did you even bother attempting it? You know, you're never going to make it. I can't remember exactly what year, but we went to silent running, so no positive, no negative feedback. It's just, here's your task, just do it. Which was, even for the directing stuff, that was a big shift in mindset to not do that. And look, I got caught out a couple of times where I was like, I sort of fell back into the old pattern. I was like, what the hell are you doing? But what was interesting was to watch, you know, sort of the younger generation, or the generations coming through now, not manage for any sort of feedback. You know, they were just almost starving for some sort of feedback, whether it was positive or negative, and people would pull out for that. You know, we had a brilliant young guy. He was like within the last couple of days of selection, completing it, and he was doing very, very well. A young 2-hour guy, and you know, and I saw him, and I said, you know, he came up and he said, "Oh, look, you know, just don't think I'm doing enough." And that was just his way of, you know, looking for some feedback. And I said, and I basically said, "Look, do you know where you're at?" And he goes, "Yep." And I said, "Do you know how long you've got to go?" He goes, "Yes." And I said, "So look, you know, if it was any different, you wouldn't be here now." I said, "So get out of your own head." I said, anyway, so that wasn't good enough. So he came back to me and he goes, "Oh, I feel really bad for, you know, trying to, you know, get your opinion and get some feedback." And I said, "Well, look, everyone's got one chance. That's yours." I said, "Just be here at the end and find out." He pulled off that afternoon, and I saw him back at the camp. And I'm like, you know, I said, "Oh, look, you know, great work for trying. You know, there's always next year. You were doing really well." He goes, "Oh," I said, "How do you feel about the decision?" He goes, "Oh, it's the worst decision of my life." And I said, "Look," I said, that's just your journey in life." I said, "You know, you come back, do exactly what you've done before, and you'll make it." And but I don't think he ever came back. So look, it's not for everyone. So, but you know, so it's more of a mental game than a physical game. That's for sure.
And I know, because I've had a few guys on who have been lucky enough to get through and pass selection and then get into the unit, and they said the first day that they get there is all, and I think every veteran that I've spoken to has said they're shitting themselves. And were you the same when you went in '92?
Is that to selection or in the unit?
Selection.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think I was... Look, I don't remember being... I was probably slightly apprehensive because I just didn't know what I was getting myself in for. But in my head, I'd said the only way I'll come off is if I've got 2 broken legs.
Yep.
And that was, you know... and they could have obviously taken me off as well. But but I thought if I'm doing okay, there's just no way I'm going to take myself off. And again, I had a good mate. We were probably halfway through, and he goes, "Oh, Weeksy, I've just had enough." I said, "What are you doing, mate? You're still here." I said, "You're actually performing okay." And he's like, "Yeah, I just don't think I've got any more to give." And I said, "Well, let them make that decision, mate." But he didn't, for whatever reason. And look, he came back and did another selection, got through. But I don't remember being scared about anything in particular. And it sort of goes back to my mindset, you know, the Kapuka days. I was just like, let's just see what comes. And I think I've been sort of known for probably a too relaxed attitude in some cases. But yeah, so I'm definitely apprehensive about, okay, what's coming. You always want to know what's around the corner. But as I said back in that day, we knew what was coming because they were yelling at us every 2 seconds. But so yeah, look, I don't remember feeling that way. But and I think I touched on, I felt like I was
peaking.
Like my, you know, your basic fitness assessment you had to do back in those days was a 5 kilometre run, your push-ups, your chin-ups, and we used to do dorsal raises. Thank God we don't do those anymore. Probably all got a bad back. But I remember, I was only 80 kilos when I did selection, and I could run like the wind, and my times going to selection for a 5-clicker were low 17s.
Wow.
And pretty quick. And I remember running this track, and I was running with a mate, and we were flying, and it was mostly downhill, so it wasn't as if we were struggling, and it was early days, and we were at like the 18-minute mark. I said, "What the hell's going on, mate?" I said, "We're not going to make it," and we passed the finish line. But I went and checked that track, and it was like 200 or 300 metres longer than the actual 5Ks. and no one did it on purpose. I think it was just lack of caring. But it's like 5Ks close enough, and again, I've never been super strong in the upper body, and I've been strong enough to do my job, but, I trained so I could do 20 chin-ups. And I think I got to about 16, and the directing staff stopped me and said, "No, your knees are bent, get off." And then I'm like, far out, I've got to do 100 sit-ups, and I've got to do all my dorsal raises to get, it was like an A pass plus 20, which was like 300 plus 20 to get through. So I'm trying to calculate this in my head, and so I had to do my 100 sit-ups. Well, no, sorry, I had to get over 80, and I think I got stopped at 83, and then the dorsal raises are easy, but so I was literally, I think I was A pass, I was plus 23. So, just scraped in, and I think that gave me a bit of a scare. But as we touched on, after that, I started feeling really good, and most of the things that came my way, not easy by any stretch of the imagination, but I felt a little bit more comfortable, had a little bit more confidence, if that makes sense. So, but look, that selection was bloody hard.
How many started and how many finished with you?
We had a massive course, mate. So it was, back in the day, it was one of the bigger ones. So I panelled for the course to attend and start. It was about, what I was told, was 220.
Wow.
I think about 185 turned up on the day. Yeah, and we ended up with about 37 finished.
Wow.
But of that 37, I think they culled about 12. So didn't leave many of us at all. But it was a tough gig.
So because I've had, as you know, I've had Dan Fortune on, and he did it 3 times, and 92 he was on that as well, and he said of all his selections, 92 was the hardest that he...
I'd have to agree with him, mate. Yeah. It was definitely the hardest. Just so everyone out there, it was the hardest. But look, we had a couple of individuals that were running that course were just absolute hard asses of guys like Greg Jack. He was the SI of the course. But just, Joe Van Droffler, a lot of those old boys, it was just hard work. I remember before your 20 clicker, which is one of your tests, I think we went out and did some navigation practice, but it was just stomping around with your packs for literally a day. And we covered about 40 or 50 kilometres in that day itself. And then I think we got in about 9 or 10 o'clock that night, had to do PT session, probably got to bed at midnight. They woke us up at 4 to start the 20 clicker.
Wow.
And then off we went. At the end of the 20 clicker, someone got in trouble for something, so then they stomped us back the other direction for 8 or 10 k's, and the amount of guys that fell out of that was just horrendous. And then part of our selection was at Collie, and Collie's just, if you know anyone from WA knows Collie, it's got its own weather system. So we did Lucky Dip there, and it was just 5 days of the crappiest, shittiest, cold, raining weather you would ever come across, and that was, honestly, it was diabolical. So I think that's probably one of the bits that made it extremely hard. As I said, some guys don't like a day of rain, but we had literally 5 days of it non-stop. Yes, that made it very difficult.
So you passed selection, and as you said, you peaked. You feeling you were peaking,
pretty good,
and at the end, did you feel you were in good shape to be picked up?
Yeah, if you take my directing staff after Lucky Dip, no, he told us none of us were getting through. And it was interesting, there was the term they used for non-infantry guys then, that you were a black hat. And I didn't realise this at the time, but the section I was in, we were all black hats. So there was some apprentices there that were, mechanics, there were some intel guys there, signallers, but literally the group of us were all non-infantry guys. And strangely enough, we were the only section that got everyone through. But the word of the day was none of us were getting through. That's why they'd lumped us all together. So yeah, that was quite funny. But yeah, look, I felt okay. But then when you get to the end, and again, it's very different now. When you got to the end, we literally stood outside what they call the old MI block, and stood for military instruction. So it's just an old building. It's still there. It's now the historical foundation. And as I said, there was about 36 or 37 of us standing there, and they would just call you up, interview, and as you came down, you weren't allowed to talk to anyone, and they separated you into two groups. So I was still, because I was weeks, I wasn't getting caught up for a while, and I was looking at this group, and I'm thinking, geez, that guy, I wonder if he's in the pass group or the fail group. But then I had no idea. But then I was looking at these guys that I thought did far better than I did, and they were over in this group. I'm thinking, oh, that must be the pass group. And I'm going, oh, no, that guy did pretty poorly. So I didn't have a clue. And I got up there, and they said, yep, you've done enough. Get out. So go and stand in that group. And so I stood in that group, and I was looking at these guys going, holy dooly. So, yeah, look, very fortunate. But and, you go back to Dan, I don't know if I could have done other selection. If they didn't select me then and there, I don't know. Honestly, don't know if I would have turned up for another one, mate. So.
Yeah, because I remember, so for the listeners, go back and listen to episode 97 where Dan, he did 3 selections, 82, 84 was picked up as a trooper and then came back as an officer in 92. It wasn't that he did 3 selections and didn't miss. He did 3. First one was told, get out. Go on, you need to mature.
Yep.
And then was picked up in 84 and then back in 92.
Correct.
And he even said it himself that it was the hardest selection that he's ever done. And I think a man of 3 selections can say that. So.
You're right, and I can't. So,
but for you to say
I'll just claim it. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Dan.
So then, mate, you go on the Rio cycle, and this is where I've spoken to a lot of guys that. They say there are things where it's... Because you're still... passing selection is just the first hurdle of getting into the unit. And did you struggle with anything on Rio?
Yeah, I did, mate. Most of it was okay. So, but look, and I almost wasn't here. And I mentioned Greg Jack. So not coming from an infantry background, I tried to get in the bush as much as possible when we were supporting battalion guys, but it wasn't patrolling or any of that sort of stuff. So... going into the patrol course, felt, I'm smart enough to know what's going on. But I was getting in trouble for some things, not that I was told I was getting in trouble, like just, not walking in the shadows, not camouflaging enough, simple things like that. So really simple stuff to do. And I remember getting my report, you didn't get weekly reports, it was sort of halfway through, and I remember Greg Jack saying, how do you think you're going? And I said, well, look, sir, I've had no feedback, and I'm still here, so I'm assuming I'm doing okay. And he goes, well, you're fucking not. And then he just smashed me for the next 5 minutes about all the things I was doing wrong. And I said to him, oh, look, so that's the first time I've heard that. And I said, I don't think I'm stupid. And I said, if someone told me to do that, I'll fix it. And look, luckily for me, he believed me, he listened to me, and I said, look, tell me what I'm doing wrong. So he gave me the opportunity to do that, and saw that, that was the case, and scraped through that one. The rest of the stuff after that was pretty good. I remember probably hitting a bit of a wall around, like it's an 18-month cycle to get through all your courses. So I remember, I think it was that demolitions course. For whatever reason there, I wasn't getting the mathematical equations right, and I'm not a jet at maths, but it wasn't that difficult. But I just remember really struggling with that. But again, that was reflective. From another time, I was like, well, what was going on there? And at the time, I was just thinking, I'm a knucklehead. I can't do it. But, there wasn't a lot of feedback. There wasn't a lot of help. Like, as I said, selection today, once you get through, it's not the bastardisation. It's not the smashing you, trying to prove that you're still hard for 18 months. It's much more of a teaching environment. But back in those days, no one was there to really help you. So you were trying to figure it out yourself and have a chat to your mates and go, what's going on? And look, I got through it okay in the end. But, I ended up going, did all those courses, did my sniper course later on, but I ended up being, my insurgent skill was water ops. So I ended up doing a 3-month course for water operations. And again, that was almost as hard as selection. It was just
because I've heard you're cold, you're wet.
Yeah. So we did ours mostly winter, had no hot showers. So you go 3 dives a day, clappering, paddling around, but it was just long days, mate. It was just, you up at 5 a.m, do PT till 6, try and get a bit of food in. Then you go out and do whatever activity, whether it was paddling, clippers, navigation, nautical navigation, could have been boats, zodiacs, caching the things, carrying the things, or into the diving phase. So 3 dives a day, and you wouldn't finish till midnight usually. So you're doing your final D service, cleaning your kit, get 3 or 4 hours sleep, that go all week. Then you get the weekend off and just literally die in the arse for the weekend and try and recover. And again, back in those days, we had no idea about what good recovery was or healthy eating or any of that sort of stuff. And then you go back, but you did that for 3 months. And I just, at the end of that 3 months, I was just shattered. I was like, then you're getting ready to go into a squadron. So it was that was a tough course. And the War Ops course is always known to be hard, but it was hard.
Yeah, mate.
Very hard.
I've spoken to a few guys who went water as well, and exactly the same thing. Said that it was, you're cold, you're wet, and it's hard, and it's a bit different to either free fall or other things that you can do in the regiment. And mate, what was the feeling like when you finally received that Sandy Beret? Because you said, as you said just then, blood, sweat, tears had gone into receiving that beret.
Look, definitely an achievement, mate. But at the time, I was very young. I was only 21, so I was, there's been blokes younger than that. But I don't think I appreciated what it did mean. So, super proud to get there, and everyone made a big deal of it. But to understand it in its entirety, of the mental effort, the physical effort, the cognitive piece, the learning going through, putting up with the shit at the time. But then it's everything to come. It's like what it gives you the confidence to do after that. And this is probably where we used to get into a lot of trouble, like to get through all that as a young bloke, and you'd have a level of confidence that was just probably quite amazing. So for everyone else on the outside looking in, it quite easily got mistook for arrogance, but one of our attributes is humility. So in and around that, we try and be humble. Don't get me wrong, there's plenty of gobby blokes, because there's lots of egos, and there's, like I said, you've got a level of confidence. But I think I won't say we've mastered it, but we've definitely got a really, really good understanding of that now, especially over the last 20 years of, yes, be really confident and have that, but have that humility with it. So look, it was awesome honour. I think it was the Governor-General that handed out our berets at the time.
Yep.
But just, again, sense of achievement, but I don't think I really fully understood it. So, I sometimes stand there and I'll show you later, mate. But, I've got my original beret stuck up on the wall with my pay stick.
Which we'll get to that later.
But meant a lot. But, again, don't think I fully appreciated what it did mean.
And a lot of the guys that I've spoken to have said that receiving your beret again is just that first step, and a lot of guys that they've spoken to who haven't made it have said, well, what was your thought of, and they just get stuck on, well, I've just got to pass selection, and then it's, oh, okay, but hang on, then you go into Rio. And a lot of the guys have said that think of actually receiving that beret, but then having a career in the unit, not just I've got the beret, I'm wearing the beret. There's so much more, and I know that a lot of guys I've spoken to have said that is, think about having a career, not just put the beret on.
Oh, most definitely, mate. And again, when you get into a squadron, you start that learning process again. So, the reinforcement cycle there for 18 months is just to give you the basics. If you go back to selection, all that does this individual show potential to continue on. Then because during the reinforcement cycle, we still lose people as well. They either can't keep up or not for them. Then you get to a squadron, and then guess what? You're the FNG, or the fucking new guy. And there's a whole range of stuff that you need to go through. And then there's the regular military stuff too. So we still do Subject 1 and Subject 2 for promotional courses, so your core courses and your all-core courses. But, from a young trooper, you'll do different roles. You might be a forward scout, so you can learn that skill set. You might be the method of entry guy. You might be the comms guy. So these are all fairly expansive courses. You might be the medic, again, 6-week intensive medical course. You go out and you do hospital stints. You learn high-end medical. So you're learning all that, and that's just one role. And then if you sit into patrol, then you've got your 2IC. So he's got a whole bunch of other skills that, from a leadership to administrative to all that. So that's your life cycle, and you go through, all those roles, then you can do specialist skills, your insurgent skills, become a sniper, all sorts of things that roll out of that. And this is why guys end up being, when you come into the unit, you're typically reverted as a soldier. You're reverted if you're a corporal or a sergeant, you're reverted back to trooper, and then you learn all those skills. So I think when I was a senior corporal, blokes I joined with were junior warrant officers. So at the same time, that's that promotion stream throughout army. But you lose your rank. You might be a trooper for 6 or 7 years. And look, it's an awesome job, so a lot of blokes aren't keen to get promoted too soon. So as you know, as you go up the rank, you become more and more admin comes into play. So, but there's just a whole bunch of roles like that, and you're dead right. And it's a career. So you'll go through your 2IC role. Everyone talks about the pinnacle being that patrol commander. You lead your own team. But look, having been through that, if you've got a good troop sergeant's an awesome job. SSM starts getting really difficult because you're looking after a squadron of blokes with that are headstrong and are smart, and they want things to happen yesterday. So look, it is definitely the career side of the house that you've got to keep that in the back of the mind.
Absolutely. And you, in 1995, you go on CT duty with 3 Squadron, and you just mentioned that it's a big learning curve. What was that like going on to CT duty?
Yeah, look, I because I came from a SIG background, I'd actually done CT or a little bit of it. But then when we went on there, it was very different. Your war rolls, patrols, and sort of those ready patrols that you talk about. So again, a whole bunch of new skill sets. So look, if I look at back in those days, there was an amazing amount of development done by the guys that came before us, but it was very much an unknown. So that capability hadn't been tried and tested at the time. So we were aiming at what we thought would be, the next hit out, I suppose. But again, that, like everything within that unit, things evolve rapidly, and it still evolves to this day. But I used to love it. So we used to do a lot of shooting. One of the courses you used to do was your driver's course. So if you're lucky, you'd go out and drive with the police and do a fast driver's course. Guys would do method of entry courses. There were sniper courses attached to that. So you would link all that, and you'd do that from Monday through Thursday. So you'd go and do all this really, really cool stuff. And then Friday, I think I've said it before, it was sort of that back down to earth day. Clean all your guns, go and refurbish everything. So, but yeah, great young lifestyle for a young bloke, and just doing cool stuff, day in, day out.
And the next year, mate, 1996, this is probably, we'll get into it later on with the losses from Afghanistan and all the other wars, but the Black Hawk disaster, the 12th of June, 1996, this is a day that, as you said, the unit, and probably going forward, is still recovering or still trying to recover from.
Yeah, it took a long time.
Yeah, and mate, you were there, like you were in the regiment, and being on the ground in the regiment, what was that like? It would have been an absolute disaster.
Yeah, and again, like a lot of things, it just took a while to understand, the ramifications of that. At the time, and it was amazing to see, and I've seen this on numerous occasions, the type of person that was in that unit, you just go out and get the job done. And at the time, I'm pretty sure that was what anyone was thinking, was like, how do we get the guys that have been injured and hurt, how do we get them out of that as quick as possible? How do you make that stuff work? We were woefully underprepared as far as the medical side. There was a couple of us that were medics on a separate helicopter that raced over, but we didn't have med kits on us. We just happened to be medics. I think we had one ambulance, and when you look, this is a squadron level exercise, so you're talking about anywhere between 80 and 100 people. So that ambulance ran out of first aid kit pretty much in the first 5 minutes. Yep. And then just the enormity of it, it doesn't really sink in. And I think that the evacuation and the sort of the recovery of our guys at the time, and then you sort of trying to understand what the hell went wrong at the same time, which we couldn't. That went for sort of hours and hours and hours, and then once we'd sort of completed the bit we could, and we were sort of happy we got most of the guys away that we needed to get away into hospitals and so on. Yeah, it was. I don't use the word surreal very often, but it was like, okay, let's head back now. And again, you had to jump on a helicopter to do that because we're out at high range, and you're like, I don't really want to get it back on that helicopter. And look, and I think a couple of guys didn't. I think they jumped in the Ambo and went back that. Didn't want to really get back in a helicopter after that. But we got back to, I think we were staying at Garbutt Air Base. And again, a lot of media around. And then I think that was sort of the first chance as a group we sort of had a chance to come together and discuss, what the hell had just happened. And even for us, mate, we didn't know who had actually passed away at that stage. And then you were sort of getting, I couldn't imagine Army was trying to do all its notifications for the next of kin. And basically what they were letting us do was make calls, but, you sort of had to swear your wife or your partner to secrecy because some of the others didn't know at the time. So yeah, that was hard. And then probably the bit that was most telling for me was where we stayed in the accommodation or in the lines. Most of the land trip was just gone. So we were there and we had to collect their kit and like go into their rooms, and some of the guys had, their own little personal shrine straight up to their partner or wife, or had, bits and pieces for their kids. And you had to collect all that stuff. And that was sort of probably when it hit home, and I think they flew a 707 in for us to get out of there. I think it was the next day. But yeah, mate, and then all the inquiry came after that, which was hard. But probably the hardest bit was the families. Of the 15 guys, I think I got to 10 funerals. I was actually part of about 5 or 6 funerals. Like carrying the casket for the guys at the time. And yeah, like I said, I don't use that term surreal very often, but we're in Sydney and we'd got he was an RSM from another unit, and he come in to teach us drill because being SAS place we got no idea about drill, but we needed to know it. And again, you want to represent your mates the best way possible. So we're all there sort of glued, and this bloke just happened to be an arsehole, typical old school warrant officer. But for the sake of it, like, this has got to be done right. So he put us through our paces for funeral drill at the time, so we could get it right and make it look good for the family. But we did that multiple times. So yeah, and then just doing all that, and then you'd be back home for a little while, and then you're dealing with the family, and yeah, that was just it was just a lot at the time.
And for you at that point too, because it's mass loss. Like the regiment hadn't dealt with that before, and do you, like, as you say, it's a real moment. Do you feel that for you at that point, as you said, you attended 10 of the 15? Did it get to a point where you're like, oh, not another one? Like, did you ever feel that?
I don't think I felt that particular feeling, but it was just like you're getting tired. You were. I remember one of the funerals we did. I was just thinking, and it was, I don't know, like, I'm trying to be nice about this, but the actual carrying the casket, and this thing was unbelievably heavy. I mean, really heavy. And we had to walk up grass, up a grassy slope.
Yep.
And then we had to traverse the grassy slope a little bit, and then that got us up to the church, and then we had to go up the steps. And because I was one of the taller ones, I was in the back end of it. And if you know much about funeral drill, you're supporting the casket. And I honestly thought my arm was going to break, my legs were going to give way. So not so much from a mental perspective, you think you've got to do the right thing for the family. And I remember, because it was so steep, the flowers that were slipping off the back, so I'm trying to hold that at the same time. So you're trying to do that, and you're trying to put on a good show for the families, and say, hey, look, really respectful, in a respectful way, your son, your brother, in some cases your father's, passed away. So trying to do the absolute best we could. And I remember us talking about those sort of things, saying, hey, put on a good show. We know we're shit at drill, but let's make sure we get it right. But again, you don't get that opportunity to grieve your mate. You're there doing a job for someone else. And look, and And I don't ever remember that coming afterwards either. I'm sure we did. I'm sure we, went to the crap with club and got in trouble and got on the piss. But yeah, I felt like we missed some of that. But
the decompress.
The decompression piece. Yeah. So, but yeah.
And I meant that in the nice.
Yes, I know.
Yeah,
I know.
The nicest way of not. And for the listener who's going, "You heartless," no, I meant that it would be mentally tolling on you as well. That's not just physical. That's what I was meaning by that.
Yeah, look, and again, probably didn't see it at the time, young and dumb. But
we've all been there.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel like I'm still there. But yeah, like you were just doing your best you could to represent it. And like I said, sadly, like a lot of things, just didn't get time to think about it, didn't get time to process it. So, but yeah, just trying to do the best for the families.
Yeah, absolutely. And in 1998, mate, you deploy for the first time to Kuwait. And and this is where I like to highlight for the non-military listeners, when you join, we're in peacetime army. So, and being, I know most veterans, they want to deploy. This is your first deployment. So, that's exciting, mate. What do you remember of that?
Yeah, look, I mean, we did a lot of training assistance teams. So we did a lot of overseas stuff, but that's just local. It's training. But yeah, to actually get a deployment, again, just more arse than class, mate. I'm just very fortunate in the right squadron at the right time and got to deploy. And at the time, this was part of, around the Iraq. So there'd obviously been the 1991 Iraq War, and then things still weren't steady or stable within the country. So, the US talked about going back in. So we deployed and they wanted support from their allies. And again, being in the SAS, usually we pride ourselves on being ready to go anywhere at any time. So the decision was made to send the squadron at the time, which just happened to be one squadron, which, just fortunately I was part of. So went through the whole deployment procedure there, got over to Kuwait, never ended up, going into country. But probably the thing out of that was just the lessons we learned out of, what it takes to deploy something of that size, the logistics of that. But when we got there, I felt like we actually ran some really, really good training and just a good opportunity to expose us to other coalition partners. So probably down the track, when we did a lot more of it, had a good understanding of what to expect. Yep. And look, I was a young corporal. I wouldn't consider myself a gob, or disrespectful, but I used to ask a lot of questions, and that got me in a lot of trouble. So, and you're a military guy. Hey, we're telling you to do this, get it done. But part of that thing of being in the SAS is being able to ask those questions. And I remember getting in some trouble because I asked too many questions about why we were doing what we were doing. But look, in a good way, and I learned some really valuable lessons of that. So we didn't get to, I suppose, get across the border, if that makes sense. But a lot of really good experiences that set us up, well for later on.
And we'll get into that in a minute. And so you come back from that trip, and then in 99 you were part of the build-up for the Olympics in 2000. And what was that like? Because going for our home Olympics, was that exciting to be part of that?
Yeah, mate, it was really, really exciting. When we spent a lot of time in Sydney itself. So we're over in Manly, up at Manly Heads there. I think they used to run the Biggest Loser out of there or something like that. But lovely location. So we'd spend an awful lot of time over there just doing what we call tac site survey. So making sure we understood the infrastructure, the network around Sydney itself. Spent a lot of time out, which was the Olympic Village and the Olympic Stadium itself. And those areas, anywhere they conduct an event. And then even that then branched out to places like Melbourne, Brisbane, where people might be staying, training, and then moving forward. So, again, for a bunch of young blokes, spent a lot of time over there, got to train. Most of your days were doing these surveys and prepping. Plus you did a bunch of training. A lot of the times the helicopters would come down, so we'd jump on those and do a lot of, what we call access training, so roping onto buildings, roping onto targets, roping onto boats. So you're doing cruise liners as well, so anything that's sort of floated in the ocean as well. Being a water operator, we did a lot of that. So yeah, just really exciting time to be a part of that. And did all that build-up, but then we weren't the squadron that ran it, so I think we handed that over to another squadron, and they actually did the Olympics proper. I think I was in a different squadron. We deployed to Timor over that period.
So the bubble for Timor goes up, mate. And what was your role over there in Timor? Because I know that's INIFET, and how long were you over there for on INIFET?
So I went on the second rotation. So Dili had been established for a couple of months at that stage, rolled into that, and very much we were taking our sort of a traditional role, or what people say, that sort of reconnaissance piece for the INTERFET. So a lot of ours was patrolling, out on the border, and we would typically do anywhere between 10 and 12 days patrols out there, but we were really well set up for that. We talked about briefly having a lot of the old guys from that Vietnam era, and we did a lot of training around that. So going operational, that felt really, really natural and felt comfortable doing it. But again, it was flat out, because you'd come back in once you'd done your patrol, done your debriefs, you'd literally roll on to what they call MREC force, so the recovery force. And so then we would patrol Dili for the next 3 days, which was meant to be our rest and recuperation. But you'd literally go out, spend your time on the range, make sure everything was working properly, weapons were sighted still and zeroed still. But then you'd also look after visiting generals, so we'd roll those tasks out as well. And then 24 hours out, one of the other patrols would come back, or multiple patrols, they'd roll into that, and then you would prep for your next 10, 12 days out in the field. But again, at the time it was quite varied. We went out on humanitarian aid tasks, really, really enjoyed it. Being a medic, went out and saw an amazing amount of different, illnesses, diseases that, sort of unfortunately a third world country, you don't get a lot of exposure to. So from a medic's perspective, helping the locals out in that way as best we could was, really rewarding, and then got to see some amazing countryside. Went out and tested not that I was a vehicle mounted guy, but we went out and did a lot of mobility stuff, which was a lot of fun. Yeah, so really, really enjoyed that. And then again, you do your different patrols where we were, sitting up in the middle of nowhere, and you didn't get to move a lot at all. We're up on very high features on mountains, just collecting what we could. And so quite a variety of tasks, which was really interesting.
So you come back from that, and I'll go forward just a little bit to 9/11. Everyone remembers where they were. What do you remember of that day? And did you foresee, and I don't think anyone did, but did you foresee back then that we would then be involved in our longest war going forward from what happened on 9/11?
No, not at all, mate. Like it was early morning for me, and I remember my father calling me and said, "Have you seen what's going on?" And obviously East Coast, a couple of hours ahead of me, and I was like, "No, I haven't." And so switched on the telly like millions of others, and just trying to comprehend what the hell was going on. I suppose I think a lot of us raced into work expecting some direction, but everyone was still trying to work it out. So we got sent home, turned up to work for work the next day, just as you normally do, and then hadn't heard a lot. Got some intelligence updates and briefs as best we could and for what we knew, but even then, as you said, mate, no one knew what that was going to eventuate to. But probably within a week, there was talk of potentially standing up a squadron that would support the US. But again, no one knew where that was or how that would play out. But eventually it did. It's just really, really sad time. Seeing some of that footage, and where would that lead, basically? So
it's something that I often think about myself and reflect, and I always bring it up in most podcasts that I do. Is I was 8 years old and I thought it was a movie. Like I got up, turned on the TV, and where's my cartoons? And thought, oh, geez, this is a good movie. And then flicked it over to the next channel and went, okay. And then I'm like, oh, the movie must be across all channels. And it wasn't until I started to see the people jump out of the building and then the next plane fly into the next tower, I went, shit, okay, this is
a lot to take in for an 8-year-old.
Yeah, this is real. And I was like, oh, okay. And I didn't understand the ramifications like, I just went, oh shit, and it was on everywhere. And mate, that day changed the world. Like we've never been the same since that day. Like,
dead right.
So many things changed, and for you, as you say, it was going into the base, and like a week later, they start to talk of deployments, and then after that, the deployments just didn't stop.
Yeah.
And you were there for all of it. And for you, so that happens, and then in 2003, you deploy to Iraq, and as you mentioned, you'd been in Kuwait, but now the Middle East is now starting to be spoken of a lot more. What was it like going to Iraq in 2003?
Yeah, look, I'm not wanting to sound like a warmonger here, but look, it was exciting. Again, we'd done a bunch of training. Again, from my perspective, really fortunate. We just happened to be in the squadron that was going to deploy, and that was, based on the rotational cycle, not because, one squadron was, one of the squadrons was better than the other. It was just purely where you sat in the cycle. So, yeah, got to deploy out there, and again, we'd only done it a few years before, so we had a good understanding of what it was going to do, how long it was going to take, but what to do when we got there. So slightly different tasking or different task sets. Better with the int picture was, the build-up intelligence was far more focused. So had a really good understanding of what we wanted to do there and what needed to be done. And then even right up till, through the last 24, 48 hours, everyone was still sort of umming and ahhing whether we were actually going to be let loose. And then, really good build-up, pre-deployment, from Kuwait, from Jordan, into like a forward staging base. And to be honest, I still don't even know where that is. We just drove there in the dark. Then from there deployed out to where we were planning to cross the border. Paul Burns was the OC at the time. Gave an awesome speech. He can talk, that bloke, he's really good. But gave an awesome speech, and then we actually got the go-ahead. So drove across the border really early hours of the morning, and I think we literally got into contact within a couple of hours. I think we were the first contact of the war. And then, just we were getting into a specific AO, and at the time our job was to try and deter weapons of mass destruction from getting fired into Israel, which had been done previously, and try to sort of keep the peace there. So yeah, one of the troops was deployed as an early warning, so they got flown in via helicopters, which was really cool. And again, transporting vehicles of that weight and that size was just a really, really complex task, and went off without a hitch, luckily. And we drove in, and part of our job was to cause as much havoc as we could, so try and stop the weapons of mass destruction, like being fired. So yeah, it was really, really a good time, and we were really fortunate. We'd gotten a lot of shootouts, but we didn't have anyone injured at that stage. So, and we were a long way away from any sort of support. And they said, at the time, nothing was coming to get us. Because we were just going to be too far inside Iraq at the time to get any help. So that sort of played on your mind a little bit.
So classic SAS recon, and doing basically what David Sterling had originally, the model of what SAS.
So there was the recon piece, but they were further in. They were the closest guys to Baghdad for a long, long time.
Yeah, right.
But our job was, again back to the Sterling days, was to cause trouble. So we went out actually looking for trouble. And this is one of the misconceptions. We get a lot of rhetoric. For some of the stuff in Afghanistan. Like, well, your whole role is reconnaissance. Well, it's not. it's one of our roles, but one of our biggest roles is direct action. Highly trained for it, well trained for it, and have the assets and the support to do it. So, yeah, we were out there doing direct action tasks, and there was an element of reconnaissance stuff in there for sure. But people almost wanted to stereotype us into this reconnaissance role because we did a lot of that in Vietnam. But even in Vietnam days, a lot of direct action tasks as far as ambushing and that was concerned as well. So,
well, they don't get called Phantom of the Jungles for nothing,
Yeah. So again, you get these so-called experts trying to pigeonhole us into one area, which is just not the case. So.
Absolutely. And how long was that deployment for?
I think in total it was just short of 6 months, mate.
Wow.
Yeah. So, but a month and a half of that was prepping and getting ready. The actual over the invasion and, from the time that went, it was only a couple of months, really.
Yeah, okay.
So, and then there was the exfil out of that. And again, we wanted to stay. We wanted to roll in, through Baghdad and all that sort of stuff, which at the time probably would have been quite feasible. But very, very quickly, things evolved to, the war of IEDs and, what the US and the UK guys had to face. But yeah, it would have been really good to keep our finger in the pie and be able to support in some level. But
as you know, years down the track, that if you had maybe kept your finger on that pie there, it could have been different with
very much so.
And history will will forever say that. So,
Look, and I mean, it was interesting. Bit of a war story where we'd come across these ammunition dump. It's just like nothing I'd ever seen before. I'm talking 2,000 hectares of just piles of ammunition. And the US had done a token bombing effort and destroyed some of it. But when we got there, the locals were pilfering landmines, explosives, and a lot of it were just locals just to burn the explosives so they could have because it was freezing cold, just something to burn for fire. But there was 3 of these bases across Iraq, and this was just one. And it would have had in the hundreds of millions of tons worth of explosives, and I'm talking large bombs. And again, I'm making an assumption here, but I reckon this was a lot of the stuff that ended up facing costing a lot of lives for the US guys, unfortunately, because no one secured that place. We said, hey, someone needs to come and keep an eye on this joint. No one ever did, not for weeks and weeks. So God knows what went out of that place and what ended up in Baghdad, as IEDs.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you come back from that trip, and in 04-05 you went on exchange to the SBS.
Yeah.
What was that like working with the British?
Yeah, so because I was a water operator, we do the exchange with the Special Boat Service. They're down in Poole. I think we tried an exchange with the SAS guys up in Hereford, but for whatever reason that it didn't occur. But the SBS one has been going for probably over 50 years now.
Yeah, right.
So quite amazing. So again, you're selected, depending on where you're at in your cycle of your career. Again, there's only a few guys at any one time that can get to go there. And at the time I was actually slated to go into the US, and the guy who was going to the US or wanted to go to the US, Bernie, he ended up in the position in the UK, and we sort of had a chat, and I said, well, let's swap them around. So we asked, and they said, yeah, you can if you want. So we swapped. So I ended up going to the UK. Yeah, again, SBS guys are very much the same as us, same sort of mindset, same sort of mentality, really good bunch of blokes. And they'll shoot me for saying this, but at that skill level, as far like soldier skills or martial skills, I think we do exceptionally well here because we've got more time to train that. But at that more strategic level, the UK's got their finger in everyone's pie, so they're really good at that. We do suffer a little bit from tall poppy syndrome in Australia, and I could tell you some stories about that where you're trying to organise something from a special forces perspective, and some colonel that doesn't understand what's going on, cuts your grass and doesn't work out how you want. But over there, they very much, they understand how it all works, much more probably mature than us. Obviously, their geopolitical situation is very different than ours. But yeah, so they don't play games, if that's probably an easy way to put it. And not from want of trying from the guys on our end, but at that more senior level, I think they just know what's at stake, and they're involved in it day in, day out. So they're just much more mature. Saying that, the work our guys do these days, without getting into specifics, is quite amazing. So and it's getting better.
And are their SOPs similar to what we run over here, or are they a little bit different, a little bit tighter, a little bit
different? Again, slightly different roles and tasks. As I said, they have their finger in everyone's pie. So for example, if you want to train in the UK and do like significant training, they don't have the land mass to do it. So we spent a lot of doing our jungle training. We'd go out to Belize. So they'd get you on a C-17, fly out to Belize, spend a couple of months in the jungle there. If you wanted to go and do your mountain and Arctic warfare training, so your MACWO stuff. We go up to Norway, or we go to the US. I think we spent nearly a month and a half out of the mountains there. I think it was the Rangers, US, was it the US? Oh no, it was the US Marine Corps, their Arctic Warfare Training Centre. So we spent a lot of time there. So you would usually drill out, and again, I mentioned we went to Oman to do all our vehicle mounted stuff, so no dramas in that, whereas, you know, in Perth, really fortunate, we can do all that, literally on our back door. So from that perspective, but again, operationally, you can get out and about, and they've got some really good ties, you know, obviously having the spread that they used to have, got a lot of good inlets into a lot of different locations, so you can go and run that training and do those operations with a lot of ease.
And in that same year, you were deployed back to Iraq. What was that like?
Yeah, completely different, mate. So it was from my perspective, I was over there. What in Australia we call them patrol commanders. Over there, they're team leaders, TLs. Just a massive learning curve. So we were going back to do really work that I'd not experienced. It was completely different than the stuff we did in 2003, and it was pretty much going after anyone in Saddam's leadership group, basically. And you'd be familiar with, they had the pack of cards, the 52 cards.
Yep.
It had the, you know, his 52 bad guys on there, if you want to call them that, and that was still in place. So we went over there to sort of break down. They'd developed different networks from Al Qaeda. And, you know, some of these guys were setting those up. So we were still out targeting those guys, breaking down those networks, and trying to win over the people, you know, of Iraq, and trying to get that stability back within the country. And it worked to varying degrees, but probably in the whole, it's still quite an unstable country.
Yeah.
But, you know, they're functional, if that makes sense. So, but not without its problems. So, but at the time, just a really different way of operating, but it was an extremely mature. So it was predominantly run by 2 SAS, and then probably every third or fourth rotation, they'd send a squadron of SBS guys in there, and you do a lot of build-up training. We'd head up to Hereford, and they'd run that training for us. You'd head back down, and probably one of the best examples of a way an operation was run to the training that was conducted. Really, really good. So when you got in country, other than the environment being different, the SOPs and the way you operated was spot on.
Yep.
So they managed that really, really well. But again, for me, massive eye-opener.
And are you learning? Sorry to cut you off. Are you learning all this to bring back to the regiment?
Well, you can, and you do, and it sort of worked in jumping forward to 2011.
Yep.
My boss, who was with me for a year at the time, we were both in Iraq at the same time with POMs, and a lot of that, the setup, we took back.
Yep.
So, interesting story. So, at the time, when I went there in 2005 with the POMs, we were the next squadron that went into Afghanistan. So, in 2006, and we took that overlay into Afghanistan.
Yeah, right.
But it did not work at all. We had our asses handed to us on a number of occasions because we used the same standard operating procedures, which worked well over there. And I've got to say, you know, that Iraq piece, that evolved every 3 to 4 months. It was evolving, so you had to change stuff. So at one point, I think Barack Obama brought in, you know, thousands and thousands of extra troops to set up checkpoints, which pretty much stopped us doing any vehicle work whatsoever. So you had to evolve very quickly. But again, as I said, we took that SOP, or standard operating procedure, into Afghan. It did not work at all. So again, we had to modify that very, very quickly.
Yeah, right.
But from a campaign perspective, so to speak, my boss and I were able to overlay that concept later on down the track, and it worked really, really well. But we'll get more into that later.
Yeah, we'll get into that. Yeah, and you went on exchange as well on Long Look with the Marines. What was that like?
Well, it wasn't so much an exchange. So Long Looks, it's usually UK over to New Zealand or something like that. It's more seconded, I suppose you could call it that. I was in one of my tours, and I basically went over. The commandos were doing operations very close to Helmand. We're still within TK or Tarankout. in our province, but they were over near a place called Kajaki Dam, which bordered, at the time, the US. The Brits had it for a long time, and then they handed that over to the US. So I got, while they were doing operations there, and I'm not sure why it was me, maybe it was an experience thing, but I went over there to do the liaison for pretty much the commandos and the Australian contingent over to the US Marine Corps. But again, just a different world. When, it feels like what you see in the Marine Corps in the movies is how it works. And look, I'm not sure, I haven't lived it and breathed it, but very regimented, very strict on how they do business. But they also had, they're very innovative. So they had their version of what we call the FET, the Female Engagement Team. But there was 100 female Marines, and they would go into villages so they could talk and liaise with the females within those villages. As you know, it's not culturally acceptable for blokes to be going,
Correct.
From a military perspective or from a social perspective, blokes going into foreign, unknown houses and speaking to ladies. So they started that concept, and it worked really, really well for them. I think Australia was very slow, and we tried to do that concept. Didn't work, but we're just late to the game. So the Marine Corps have been, they're well known for trying stuff like that and doing it, whether it filters down, because they were taking unbelievable losses at the time. As you know, we lost 41 Australians. I was there one day, and they lost 21 Americans in one battle.
Wow.
And about 40 wounded just in one day. And again, they have a very, very different outlook on how that, I remember the doctor briefing the 2-star general about one of the young fellows that became a quadruple amputee. And he goes, "Oh, look, we've got great technology. We'll fix him up, send him on his way." But that was their approach, to I think at the time there was over 200,000 Marines, not in Afghanistan, but they built up to that. Whereas when I spoke to that 2-star general, he said, they normally sit at about 170,000. They were about to downscale, and I said, "Well, what do you do with those 50,000 guys and girls?" And he goes, "Just got to find another job." And I said, "What if they want to stay?" He goes, "They don't get to stay."
Wow.
So yeah, really different concept. Whereas you can be an Australian soldier for your whole career if you want, but just not their setup, unfortunately.
Yeah, wow. And as you say, it's different from, and like, whether you look at it, as you say, with the just exchange and seeing how other countries work, and for you, Afghanistan, this was your first time your first of many trips in the country. And do you have any, like, in that 06 trip, did you get into a lot of contacts at that point, or were you? Yeah.
So in the 06 one, I was still with the POMs.
Yep.
So still
in
the UK. Yep. So sorry, that Marine trip was a later one.
Right.
But 2006. So we deployed to Oman to do a lot of build-up training. We were there for a month, and we were meant to come back, but the OC at the time made the decision that we didn't have the time. So some of the boys went back, like the troop guys, all the team leaders stayed. So we'd already spent a month in Oman, and that trip was going to be 8 months long. So we got in, and UK squadrons are a bit smaller than the Australian ones. So once we divvied up the task, so we had a patrol looking after training of our Indigenous force. They were up, just above Kabul. We had another patrol that used to look after special tasks, and I won't go into that, but that took one of your patrols away. So what was left was your assault force, so to speak, or your targeting group. And there wasn't a lot of us, about 16 or 17 of us, and it felt very light on. But yeah, so as we built up into that, and again, because we were the first guys there, a lot of our time was spent building intelligence pictures, and what was really good is our OC at the time. He was probably the first one to, everyone was sort of bidding for the same assets. Everyone was sort of trying to target the same people. And he was sort of the one that, I suppose, the initial concept of the Joint Priorities Effects List, the JPEL as they call it later on. So understanding the networks, and then understanding how we would allocate and who would target, between the US, UK, Australia, and where they were located. So yeah, that was a lot of that build-up. But as we went along, over 8 months, we got a lot of shootouts. Sadly, I think we lost 4 guys out of the squadron, only a small squadron. We had 2 guys killed in a contact, another guy badly wounded. But then we had a really unfortunate accident where one of the I-Star assets that the UK uses, called a Nimrod, it's a big aircraft they use, they've been around for a long time. We had 2 of our guys on that. It was air-to-air refuelling, caught fire, unfortunately exploded in mid-air. Yeah. Unfortunately killed everyone on board. So out of a small squadron, we lost a few guys there, so that was hard. But from an operational perspective, really, lots of varying tasks, lots of really good stuff. So yeah, good.
So that happens, mate, and which is tragic that you lost the guys. Is there any other significant things that happen on that deployment in 06?
Oh yeah, look, quite a few. So just understanding the gravity of everything that was going on. It was just growing rapidly. The amount of people coming into country, to get involved in supporting the Afghan people and removing the Taliban. So yeah, it was sort of non-stop. Where we were operating with the POMs at the time in Helmand, very, very different than TK. Just much more day-to-day as a, bad guys everywhere, basically. But probably the thing that stood out to me the most there was you could jump on a single flight and then you're back in the UK. But there was no mention, no talk, other than maybe something small on the news if you watched it. But yeah, it was like it never existed, whereas at least in Australia, it was in the news. People were still very supportive of it. But back in the UK, it was like stepping into a different world, and because you could do it in a few hours, you could get from Kabul or Kandahar back to, mainstream UK. It's just a really, really weird feeling, yeah. So.
And, well, something we can talk about definitely down the track is that decompression of, 1 minute you're in a war zone, the next minute you're eating dinner at a table. Yes, I think the World War I, World War II and Vietnam guys had some time to decompress, as you poor buggers.
Yeah, like it was very, as you're right, it took a little while to get off the front line, or you could, you sort of, your impression of World War I and how things were conducted, it was just, if you're in the front line, just horrendous, but, not very far back, there was chateaus and chalets and, almost normal life, even though, you were going back there, but, and you could take some time out and they rotated guys through those front lines. So we used to be on a rotation of 6 months on, 6 months off, back for 6 months, and then you'd come back to Australia and do a year on team, so the counter-terrorist duties, which again was...
Well, it's not really a break,
wasn't a break.
It?
No, it wasn't. It was a lot of work, actually. And, that went on for years and years and years, and we never did the full 6 months, because if you did 6 months, that incurred a bunch of special conditions that you were entitled to as a soldier or a defence member, which included, some leave, some additional benefits and some pay. So we used to do 5 months and 2 weeks just so we would avoid that. But that was done on purpose so we could continue that rotation. Look, unlike our US and UK counterparts, they had 4 squadrons to rotate through, so you could always have a proper rest, whereas we only had the 3 squadrons at the time to rotate through, so you never really got a rest. So that was a full-on period. Yeah.
So you come back from your 06 trip, and this is where you get back to Australia, and then you're not long back in Australia, mate, and then you're back to TK again in 07.
Well, I deployed that a couple of months later again, so so when I finished, I think I finished in October, November in the UK, literally packed up from the UK over November, December, got back to Australia, and then deployed in 07. So, look, and it was a bit more low-key. Things were still evolving in that TK space for Australia. Don't be wrong, there's still a lot of work to do and a lot of effort, but things were still evolving. And then, within a year, so 2008, picked up significantly into 9, 10, 11 and 12. Yeah. That, if you stood there in 2007 and then you were transported to 2010, completely different battle space. Yeah.
And for you, I'd like to highlight this because you had the, well, let's say the luxury, well, I don't know if it's not a luxury, but you deployed with the Brits, you'd come back to Australia, and the mission profiles, was every country doing it differently, or was it all the same? What was happening?
Yes, very much so. So the UK went, as I said, they went from that Iraq piece straight to Afghan, but in a targeting role. Didn't do it very well to begin with, but again, got very good at it. Whereas Australia evolved in that a little bit more slowly. And again, this is part of some of the stuff that didn't go well in Australia. So just, we went there, and I don't think we had a clear campaign plan of how we were going to do what we needed to do. And and SAS has been accused of running its own show for a little while, but no one gave us any actual direction of what you need to do. But we knew, there was a reconstruction task force there, and there was a mentoring task force, and for those guys and girls to operate, they had to be protected. So that was our primary role. And look, we did pretty much come up with that through lack of direction from a senior leadership. So, and then, 2 Commando joined us. And then, it was pretty much making that onion ring effect around, the Australian contingent and try and protect them so that would free them up to do the work for the Afghan people, build roads, build schools.
Yep, hearts and minds.
Hearts and minds, but also build skilled labour force, that could continue that. So from that perspective, I think Australia had some good direction, but it was how are we going to protect the Australians to do that? So pretty much we said, well, the best way for us to do that is to target the Taliban network and break that down and make it really hard for them. But sadly, we weren't supported as well as we should have been. So if you look at the UK model, as soon as they knew that's what they were going to do, they had aircraft to support it, they had drone support, intelligence support, whereas that virtually never came for Australia. We tried in dribs and drabs. We had on-the-ground intelligence, and very good. But as far as that strategic level intelligence, we were always beg, borrowing, stealing from from our neighbours, and they're good because we were there to support them. But a lot of people are under the misconception about the helicopters. We got 2 Chinooks, Australian Chinooks, but they only supported us for about 4 days out of the month. And if there was no target, we wouldn't use them. We might use them for some training, but they went into the ISAF, basically what we used to call the Brown Ring Run, and they would deliver essential stores and goods and people around the battlefield. But as far as supporting us in targeting operations, it was very, very minimal. So it wasn't until 2008 or 9, I think it's 2009, the US supplied us with a bunch of helicopters. And when I say a bunch, it was 4, plus some protective aircraft, some Apaches, and then that allowed us to really go after the network. And before that, we were still driving around getting blown up a lot with IEDs. So it made us really hard. It made it very difficult for us to achieve our task, which was protecting Australians, when we had to get there ourselves. And, on a number of occasions we were blown up on the way doing it. So then that made it difficult to protect the Australians. So once we got the helos, that freed us up to do a lot more work.
So why, in that sense, mate, why wasn't our Black Hawks deployed to help us, or what was the reasoning behind them not coming over and supporting our effort?
Mate, I'd love to sit here and say I had the answer to that. And the best we ever got is we pressured one of the visiting generals a lot and said, well, why can't we get our own task force, our own rotary wing task force to support this operation? The biggest threat we have is driving down the road and getting blown up, because that's the best weapon they've got against us. And we just continually do it. So why wouldn't you support us with some more helicopters to move us around the battlefield? And the best we got was one of the generals said, Australia was not willing to lose a helicopter. And, just saying that to any average day person, like, well, you're willing to lose a soldier on the ground or in a vehicle, but you're not willing to fly a helicopter around. Like, as you know, the air threat there was minimal. So why wouldn't you do that? We have very good helicopters here. We had the Tiger helicopter, which spent 20 years in Australia, and it got to full operational capability, or what we call FOC. And then couple of months later, they binned it. So there would have been a lot of frustrated pilots that they could have provided that task force for us. Would have made our job a lot easier, a lot safer. But look, ultimately, mate, I don't know why they wouldn't do that or wouldn't go that far. You'd like to think it just wasn't monetarily. You know, one of the Black Hawks supporting us from the US contingent crashed in supporting us and, you know, unfortunately killed some of our commando brothers. It, you know, injured a lot of US guys. So, but they were willing to throw that support behind us to achieve the mission. So, yeah.
It's
frustrating.
Frustrating and crazy to think that, you know, you've got capable guys and, you know, our Black Hawk guys are very, very capable at doing the job, and yet they're sitting on the sideline and they're eager at the bit to get in and, you know, be part of it and help you guys and affect the battle space more so than, you know, not. It just...
Yeah, it brings a level of strategic advantage to us.
Yeah, 100%.
That we just never had. So, you know, as I said, their primary weapon to defeat us was IEDs.
Which they got very, very good at.
And they did it exceptionally well, yet we just kept driving into it. So it doesn't make sense, mate.
Yeah, no. So that 07 trip, as you mentioned, you see standing there in 07 to then foresee two different wars. And I had this conversation with and just on that topic, I had a discussion with a historian back talking about the First World War. And they said in 1914, a Napoleonic soldier would understand the fighting in 1914, as in 1918, a modern soldier would see that this is modern-day warfare. And that's what you're saying, they're two different wars back in 2007 to 2010.
Yeah, very much so. And, you know, a couple of my mates, and we talk about if you had, and I think I alluded to this, if you'd taken one of us from 2007 and you were able to transport them ahead in time to 2009, 10 or 11, you know, you'd be woefully underdone as far as what you need. So we were fortunate that we were able to evolve with the threat, and, you know, we made a significant effort to pass, you know, tactics, techniques and procedures, TTPs, back to the guys we were training. We had a good ability to do that, and like I was in that role for a while where we'd take feedback coming from, you know, that zone or that war zone, and we would implement that within our training where we could, so the guys would be better prepared when they turned up. So yeah, but if we didn't evolve as we did, I think we would have took a lot more casualties.
Because I think for us and being civilians, mate, I think there wasn't, like, we didn't understand it. Like, as civilians, we were like, well, what's going on? Like, and I mean, from what I'm getting from you is that there wasn't a clear mission profile of, well, what's going on. Like, so we're sort of, as you say, you're not making it up, but you're sort of doing things on the fly to try and get, you know, to learn and evolve with the war that's going on. But for us, it was, and there wasn't a lot brought out to, like, yeah, okay, there was the media stuff, a casualty in Afghanistan or a death in Afghanistan, but there was no, we didn't as civilians, we never understood what was going on.
And mate, this is part of the reason the documentary's coming out, especially from an SAS perspective. But yeah, look, part of the thing we talk about there is, and it was defence policy, that, you know, not much would come back. And look, there's obviously a strategic reason behind that and a security reason behind that.
Of course.
But if you look at, you know, the US or the UK or some of our other allies there, you know, they would be more exposed to information coming out of there. And I think one of the guys in the doco talks about it, but, you know, the only thing that ever seemed to come back to Australia was negative. So so if that's all you're hearing, you know, the Australian population is going to lose support for its soldiers over there, unfortunately, and, you know, obviously give the government a hard time about that. But yeah, there was a ton of great stuff happening, you know, from the mentoring, the reconstruction task force to, you know, some of the more extreme bits in our area, but there, you know, some amazing work that the guys did over there, but just no one ever heard about it. And look, yeah, from our perspective, you know, they're just getting a negative narrative when there was a lot of good work. So yeah, I'm not surprised that, you know, we sort of lost the support of the Australian population. And I don't think that was directly aimed at Australian soldiers at all. But, you know, it made it really, really difficult. So especially when you're coming back and you're not seeing that, or you're not seeing the support, and this is over 20 years. So
Yeah, cool.
yeah, a little bit sad to say the least.
Absolutely, and like, as you say, like the enemy, they were evolving too. They weren't, and you know, as some people go, they're idiots. Well, no, they weren't. They were evolving. They were learning our TTPs and how you guys did business, and they were evolving as well. So it wasn't just well, they're going to stick to the same tactics.
Yeah, look, and like I said, mate, very cunning, very shrewd, and as we know, Afghan's been around a long, long, long time, well before us and after, and we seem to keep making the same mistakes of going into Afghanistan. You know, and you feel for the people there, but yeah, as you touched on, like the fact that we could evolve and do that, you know, pretty much, yeah, as the old saying goes, won every battle, lost the war, and that's hard for people to take. So, and even you get to the end, and when there was the withdrawal out of Afghanistan, and then the Taliban rolled back in very quickly, and it was interesting, you know, from a soldier's perspective that had fought there for a lot of time. You know, the rhetoric coming out of the media is they just couldn't believe how quickly the Taliban had taken over. Well, it's really quite a simple equation, because we told in 2014 we were going to leave. So if you were a betting man back then, you know, the Taliban were going to make a resurgence. There'd be backdoor deals made about how are they going to manage that. So that would have been occurring from 2014 onwards, all the way up to 2020. And, you know, a lot of them are aligned, a lot of them from the same clan, tribe. So from that perspective, mate, they're doing deals on how they're going to make this work, and you know, because life's going to go on for them. So we're going to leave. They need to exist, and unfortunately, yeah, it wasn't a surprise to most soldiers that the Taliban rolled back in there very quickly. So, and
as you say, mate, they just played the waiting game. They knew that as soon as they said troops are going to be pulled out in 2014, it's okay. Well, we'll just wait. We'll just wait, and you've been on the ground, and I've spoken to a lot of the guys, and they said it themselves. They said Afghanistan was as corrupt as anything. So if the highest bidder, sure.
Yeah, very much so, mate. And look, and I think that's part of the thing that, you know, most people don't understand. You know, like what do the Afghan people want? You know, so yes, we rolled in there to remove the Taliban, you know, after 9/11, but maybe we stayed too long. Maybe once we'd done that, maybe we should have pulled out. You know, but again, these things. As a soldier, from a political perspective, you don't see too much of that. But they're the questions that roll on you. Why did we stay that long? You know, most of our prime ministers, they didn't say it publicly, but you can go and have a look at the records very, very quickly, and most of them are like, what are we still doing there? Yet they were still supporting it all the way through. So, you know, like if you didn't want us to be there, don't be there. But again, we have this US and Australian alliance. but, you know,
good old ANZUS. Yep.
Yes, we've got to support them. So, you know, and as long as people understand that, and you know, and you get to make that decision, you need to live with that decision, obviously. So.
But as you say, mate, hindsight's a wonderful thing.
It is.
Looking back now, and as you've been on the ground, and many times, it is. Yeah, could we have done better? Should we have done? They're all hindsight. Hindsight is those things that you look back in time, and unfortunately you can't go back. You can only go forward. And as you said, Afghanistan it's a country that has never been conquered. So and to think that powers that be that would conquer it, and it's shown again that it can't be conquered.
Like I said, we probably should have just went in and removed the Taliban, and then go from there. But you know, look, you know. I'm not a decision maker.
Well, in your own little space, mate. Yeah. So that happens 07, mate, and then this is where it just gets nuts, and you're back again in 2008. And this, I want to talk. You don't go unscathed on this trip in 2008, and you've lost. So the regiment's starting to lose guys. You lost Andy Russell in 2002. Matty Locke's killed in 2007, and in 2008 you were deployed, and you're in the vehicle with Sean McCarthy, who was killed by an IED. I've had Harry Moff on the podcast, episode 49, and he's spoken about that day. Can you tell me, you were in that vehicle and what happened on that day?
Yeah, I'd like to say Moff's wrong. No. No, Moff and I still discuss this, and Moff was the driver. I was the vehicle commander, if you want to call it that. Obviously, had Sean in the back. He was doing, the specialist comms piece that he was there for, and we had our interpreter in the back as well. So look, we'd been out on patrol. We were out getting the atmospherics, if you want to call it that, for around the region. We'd sort of made a stop, stayed overnight, got up the next morning to leave. There was the normal chit-chat on the radio, or the ICOM as we called it. The Taliban would do that regularly, we used to call it smack talk, about who they were going to attack and when they were going to attack, and it was just sort of a game of cat and mouse, I suppose. Rolled out on the patrol. We're pretty much going to head back to our main base and head down past a couple other forward operating bases, or FOBs as they call them. But look, everything felt, reasonably normal. We were getting, a fair amount of smack talk, and unfortunately, that wasn't smack talk at this stage, and we hit an IED. And look, there's still a lot of debate about whether it was pressure, whether it was an RCID, so remote controlled IED, whether we followed the other vehicles, whether we took a different route. But sort of in the end, I always say, you can do everything right and still get unlucky. So I think we got a little bit unlucky that day, and sadly, Sean was killed in that blast. Moff was injured, quite bad. Like, to look at Moff, all in one piece, but as he went on, almost lost a leg through infection and that sort of stuff, and had to be evacuated out of the country. So really fortunate for him. He's still there, he's still functional, which is great. Our interpreter, who was in the back with Sean, again, used to sit there and watch him, and sometimes he'd have a leg inside the car, sometimes he'd have a leg outside the car. On this day, he just happened to have the leg inside the car, and unfortunately he lost that leg. But he's still out operating now, out and about. God bless him. And then myself, sustained some minor broken bone stuff, but just different experience. They talk about time slowing down when there's critical events happening, and then from a cognitive perspective, in my mind, I was going through, because we had a vehicle that we'd been told about that had been blown up not long ago, and one of the guys that was injured, he was crawling away from the explosion, thought he was okay, and the engine block came down and hit him. So that was in my mind as I was flying through there. I was like, when you land, wherever you land, if you can get up, run away. If you if not, crawl. So look, the difference of that one is that IED went under their engine block. Ours went off under the centre of the car, which just happened to be where Sean was standing. Yeah, and when I landed on all fours, and I sort of broke a kneecap and broke some bones in my wrists. I think it re-fractured an old injury in my back. But it was still good enough to crawl away. It's strange, mate. You have a large, big tub of ammonium nitrate, goes off with a bang. I don't remember hearing a thing. So they say your body's an amazing thing, and you can shut down your hearing very, very quickly, but I don't remember hearing the bang. So from my perspective, we have a drill called a 5 and 25, so just crawling around. At that stage, I became aware of Moff sort of yell out to me saying, he was okay, but he thought Sean, was in serious trouble. I could see my terp off to my right-hand side. Didn't really understand what was wrong with him at the time. And you sort of think you're with it, but you're not. You're in shock, even blast shock. So, I was trying to radio back to the other cars just to wait. And then from there, I thought I'd done a clearance. I don't know if I actually got through it or not. Got to Moff and Sean. As I said, Sean was in a bad way. Pretty much at that stage, gave the all clear for him to come down. Medics, a couple of the guys came down, worked on Sean, did an amazing job trying to keep him alive. I think at this stage, I thought I was okay, but I was probably in la-la land. And then the guys just did a big clearance, made sure the area was safe. And then we eventually got the helicopters in to look, and there was a bit of a stuff-up on our, or lack of understanding or lack of comms. Where we were was clear, but where the helicopters were stationed was what they called I think it was a zone red or a code red, so they couldn't actually take off. So that delayed the evacuation of Sean, but I said it wouldn't have made any difference if they had been there waiting for him, mate. He was in a position that was unrecoverable, sadly. Wal, our medic, did an amazing job. And yeah, look, I think Wal's earned the Nursing Cross and Bar a couple of times, for his service and some of the work he did, which was amazing. So if you're out there, Wal, well done. But yeah, tough for him, and tough for the team. So we all evacuated, as in we got flown back to TK, and the poor old boys had to jump back in the cars and then drive the rest of the way back, which was hard work. So yeah, the boys tell the story of, scary moments where you'd bang into something or drag the car up or something, and it's like, oh shit, and your heart's in your mouth. So
absolutely.
waiting for another IED. So, and again, that was the last LRPV patrol we did. Just the IEDs were getting very sophisticated, and they, as you said, they're a cunning enemy. So they knew where to position the charges now. And then we went to Bushmaster. But again, we were still driving, and I think it was only a couple of weeks later, and we hit another IED trying to get to another job, and Mark Donaldson was on that one. So, and him and a couple of other guys were, not seriously injured, but injured nonetheless. They sent a helicopter out to pick us up, and that helicopter crashed while trying to pick us up. That was an interesting day. So the evac chopper crashed on trying to pick up the injured guys. So we were stuck out there for a day, and I think the Dutch came and recovered us about 12 hours later. So yeah, it was a big day out.
I remember talking to Moff about it, and through he, as you've had many conversations with him over the years, he said he still has that where he blames himself.
Yep.
And he said to me in the podcast that he'd finally accepted it, but it still sits with him, and you don't want to lose anyone. And for you, like, that was pretty early on in your deployment too, wasn't it? So you're...
Yeah, mate. It was... look, I can't remember how long we're... Probably within a month, I'd say. Not too long. Yeah, and then... But, I had to do a couple of weeks of recovery, but I didn't want to leave. I just thought... For me, I just thought that wasn't setting the right example for the guys, they talk about leadership, and so I just made the decision to stay. I could have went home, but I just wanted to stay. And then I think it was I'd literally just recovered, and we had a high value target come up, and I wanted to go on that job, but in hindsight that was a mistake. We had some cav guys driving our Bushmaster around, they were awesome. And then dropped us off. We were about a 7k walk in. It was across a ploughed field, and I'd literally just cut my cast off my arm. It was a bit like that Black Hawk Down scene. It's like I'm cutting the cast off. If the doc ended up doing it for me, but I was in real no condition. My knee was still healing. My wrist was still stuffed. My back was still a bad way. So by the time I got to the target with the boys, I would have been a liability, I reckon. So I was stuffed, and we had a minor ruckus on the target. I think his bodyguard got in a fight with one of our dogs, and then but because of that, the cab guys couldn't come pick us up, so we had to walk with another 7k's back, and I was ratchet at the end of that.
You would have been.
So, but yeah, look, good lesson. But for me, it meant a lot to stay in country, and then long road to recovery after that. But yeah, we had another 4 or 5 months after that. So, and
you being team leader, you never ever want to lose guys under your watch, and now that you've 2008 was a long time ago, at that point, as you said, you've got that warrior mindset to stay and be for your own mental health. How were you travelling mentally at that point? Was it just crack on with the mission, keep going, and have you reflected on that as the years have gone on?
Yeah, man, I have. I think I'm one of those typical blokes that's very good that compartmentalises stuff. I can't remember the guy's name, but he talks about men having a box for everything. So, a box for the car, a box for the wife, and there's the nothing box. So I think I was very good at putting that stuff away and getting on with the job. And then at some point you've got to come back and relive it, reflect on it, learn from it, hopefully. And look, I think I've got a fairly pragmatic view of doing that, and it's worked for me so far. And part of that is, the guys that come to this unit or serve in that unit, and Sean, was a signaller, but came out on those jobs to support us. But we're all volunteers, and I think we've got a pretty good idea of what we're getting ourselves in for. And you don't want to be a casualty. No one's going there, thinking they're going to die. But I think there's a realistic expectation that can happen. And when it does, it's never good at all. But my first thoughts are always, after that Black Hawk accident, it's the family. It's like, what's that going to be like? And we know Dave and Mary, Sean's mum and dad, they're just unbelievable people. They could have taken a really bitter view towards that. But they're some of our biggest supporters.
Which we're going to talk about in the documentary.
Yeah, for sure. And then, just amazingly stoic people, big supporters, and I can't imagine what it's like, to be in their position. But, my first thoughts are always to the family, that's their loss, it's a mate of ours, but that's their family.
Yep.
So that's tough, really tough to deal with.
Absolutely.
But from a dealing with a perspective, I'm usually okay with it. I might be callous, I might be hard, I'm not sure, but I think I've got a good way of processing that, dealing with it, and then having to move on. So
well, as you say as well, life doesn't stop. So it's tragic, and as callous as that sounds, it's true. Life cracks on, and you got to keep moving forward. And as you say, you're in a war, so war doesn't stop.
And look, for us, mate, this podcast has been done one day before Anzac Day, so that you don't just remember them on that day. You think about your mates almost every day.
Yep.
But like I said, you move on with your life. But for the family, they've got to live that every day. So I couldn't imagine that. So.
Absolutely. And you mentioned Dono on this trip was for his actions, he was awarded a Victoria Cross.
Yep.
And I've had Troy on as well, talking about that day as well. Yep. So these are all starting to interlock and capture history, which is...
Yeah, well, that wasn't that event, but that was, later on.
Yeah, later on. Yep.
Kazaruzgan, so we deployed out there a little while later. And we ran a number of operations out of there with some US ODA guys. But again, we fell into that old trap of we set a pattern, and they gave us a hiding for setting a pattern. So, the first couple of operations went really, really well. I think we did it once too often. And they kicked our ass for it. So, but the boys in that area, that battle, did an amazing job. To get to where they got to and survive that, because that was just a phenomenal amount of bad guys, and just in a position you'd never want to be in, unfortunately. And Dono, for the right reason, did some amazing stuff. And there's a whole bunch of blokes there that did plenty of good stuff.
Absolutely.
Well deserved, and good on him.
And as You'll hear the full story in Troy's podcast, and his will come out before Wayne's comes out. So go back, and I already know the sequence of numbers, so it's episode 115. So go back and listen to that to hear the full story of what Wayne is actually talking about. So that's that sequence, and of that, mate, that trip, what you sent through to me in the bio. So of your troop of 24. You suffered 1 killed in action with being Sean, and 19 were wounded in action. So not many come home unscathed.
No, mate, very few actually. And look at that battle we talked about with Dono and up in Kazaruzgan. I think there was 9 guys wounded in that, and Gibbo probably the worst of that. Ended up being flown to Germany, took a round through the chest, sort of clipped a lung, went out the other side. Unfortunately, we had a US guy was killed. Multiple wounds from that. But even throughout the other piece, as we said, IED for Dono and one of the guys, my IED incident. So out of that troop, which not a big bunch of, as in a big group of people. So had a lot of guys wounded, and it was yeah, a lot went on. Again, some really varied tasks, some really good stuff, but, dangerous place.
Absolutely, mate. Absolutely. We're just going to take a quick break, mate, and we'll come back. Welcome back from that little short break. So, mate, in 2009, you come back from your 08 trip, and you posted to Battle Troop. What was Battle Troop?
Yeah, mate, so Battle Troop sits under our Operational Support Squadron. So Op Support Squadron facilitates a lot of the training that occurs. We talked about selection early on, so OSS pretty much runs that selection with the support of other squadrons. And then from that, within that, there's a bunch of different groups that can, they run your water training, they'll run your free fall, they'll run your mobility. And I sat in Battle Troop, and Battle Troop was responsible for your close quarter battle techniques, your sniper capability, canine or dog capability at the time, our MOE, so method of entry, so that's manual and explosive, and then, when actually drones came under that as well. So it had a fairly big remit, and you had instructors in each one of those locations, and you would pretty much run those courses, responsible for, setting them up, running them, keeping the standards, and then any evolution of those capabilities. So that would run out of there, and again, you would rely on squadrons to support that. So for the CQB course, for example, you'd run the new guys through the course, but you would have assistant instructors, and they would come from the squadrons to run that course. Mm-hmm. But OSS, has pretty much been there since the beginning, and it's that facility that continues to make the unit run. So when the guys come through from selection, they're responsible for getting through their reinforcement cycle and then facilitating that into the squadrons. So raise, train, sustain, I suppose you call it.
And for you there, were you seeing that change needed to happen, or?
Yeah, mate. Funnily enough, I did. It was more just out of curiosity. And like I said, I don't know what triggered it in me. I just thought we could potentially do training a slightly better way, but I just felt like chatting to some of the blokes after their courses. They weren't happy. I think I've touched on this before, but one of the guys, he had a really good conversation with him, and he's like, one of his core skills, his part of your life is carrying a firearm for your job. And, said he didn't want to touch one, for a year after that, or 3 months or whatever it was. And, that sort of struck a chord, and I thought, well, why is that? So in my head, in my little world, I just sort of asked a few more of those questions, and I just thought, we're doing this, hard selection. So we're getting, most of the time we're getting the right people through the door. Mm. Why are we continuing to, smash them on the way through? And, there's always got to be a standard, especially for that unit. But I just thought there's better means and ways to train them. And look, at the time, mate, I didn't have a clue how to do it. I just thought something's got to change. And eventually I ended up as the Battle Troop, Sergeant Major, I suppose. And then I wanted to do all these things, and I had an idea in my head how we would do them, but I didn't have the tools or the talent, the knowledge, the skills to facilitate that. So that was a massive eye-opener for me. And I thought, I need to do something about that. So that sort of started me on my journey to better educating myself, I suppose. So, doing degrees in training and development, doing cognitive coaching courses, understanding that world a little bit better, but more so with the experience I've got, how do I then link that back into the training world? Mm. And, as you know, Army has a certain standard that we've got to achieve. Look, unfortunately, a lot of it's antiquated. But I still had to fit within that process. So how do we take all this information, build it, and ultimately I'm, trying to make a better product at the end of the day. I want to make that next soldier coming through better than me. Mm. So that was sort of that journey we went on, and that took a long time. And I was just very fortunate. I had some good guys that I asked to come down and help me out, and they did. So I made their life very difficult.
But I think too, and this is what you get through to the non-military listener, mate, is that you're striving for excellence, and you will, no matter what means to do that, that's just, there's no, failure's not an option. You have to strive for that excellence. So I understand it. I get what you're trying to do.
And I think I think that's even lost within the military, mate. The blokes that come into that unit, there's a mindset that's just almost impossible to describe. And then if they get through, they continue that mindset on into pretty much everything they do. Whether it's, we talk about the guys doing mobility, they'll go and do that in their own time. They'll ride motorbikes or they'll drive cars. Free fallers will go out, they'll parachute on their weekends. Divers will go and, advance that capability any way they know how. The canine capability is next level. Took us a little while to get that thing underway, but once we got it, the guys just took that to one of their best capabilities in the world, and that's just their mindset. And our guys do all their own husbandry for the dogs, so looking after canines, when you're in that cell or you're a dog handler, that's a full-time job. And I mean, not just 9 to 5. That's, you come in, you run the dogs in the morning. During your leave period, you have to look after the dogs. There's no one there to take care of them. We don't have funding for, people to come and manage the dogs. You've got to be taken to the vet. It's classed as a quarantine facility. So, there has to be special conditions, legislation that's got to be met. Those guys do all of that. They live and breathe it. So, so they're a special breed in their own. But just amazing. But the capability that brings is just next level. It's saved a lot of lives. But even now I hear, that it's under threat because, we're not at war, but, and it costs money. So, but it took, 20 years, to develop that capability where it is now. But it's easy for people to get rid of that and lose sight of what it is.
And it's something you just mentioned, that we were willing to lose a helicopter. We weren't willing to lose a helicopter, but a soldier, we're willing to, that seemed okay.
Put them at risk.
Yeah, put them at risk. But it's been proven that the dogs, they've saved lives, and they saved countless lives in the 20 years that we were in Afghanistan. And it all, as you say, and I hate to say it, but it all comes back to money again. Everything always revolves, and if we can cut costs, we will. But it's a premier part of what the unit is. I just don't understand.
And look, it's interesting, and I've been involved in this world a little while now, and I see it, whether it be our other government agencies or defence, do some work for the RAF, and I see that as well. But typically the first place we take funding is out of the training model, which is the biggest mistake. If you train people well, operationally, they'll make things work. And look, you never, it's always that initial look, I don't want to take away from the operational people, but if you've got a good training basis and you've got a solid foundation around that training to be operational, when you're operational, you'll make it work. Not ideal, but you've got those skills from a good training base. But if you take away from the training base early on, you can never fix that up operationally ever.
So you're pushing shit up here, aren't you?
You
Really?
certainly are. So, but the biggest thing is you're putting people at risk. So you're transferring that risk from, in that training, because I'm going to take some money out of that. Operationally, they're at a far greater risk if you don't train them properly in the first place. So
It's wild, mate.
but I see it every day. So.
Yeah, I just can't understand it. Like I sit here across from you, and I'm shaking my head because it's wild to think that such a capable, proven thing that's working that now is under threat. Like it's just. Yeah, I could go on.
Hope it'll stay.
Yeah, let's hope. We could open another can of worms there, but I'll leave that one. So, and for you, is it because you were posted to battle troop? Is that in a sense of giving back to the regiment, or?
Yeah, look at it. Unfortunately, mate, and probably before my time, but OSS sort of sadly. Sort of at one stage was a bit of a dumping ground. If you perceive that you couldn't cut the mustard in a squadron, they'd push you down to down to OSS. Battle troop being one of those elements, which is just a really, really poor way of doing business, because all your new guys are coming through to potentially be betrayed by those people that you believe aren't worthy of being within a squadron. So part of what I wanted to do was to change that mindset, and again, took a while, but I wanted the guys in the squadrons to see if you came down to OSS, that was an opportunity for you to learn, grow, integrate with the new guys coming through. So they're going to be the guys you're working with. So, I want you to be a part of that. And even while I was the RSM, I used to make the guys write me a letter, because you were going to get posted. If you're going to get posted there as part of your cycle, that was going to happen. But, I wanted that to have some meaning for the guys. So, I used to make them write me a letter and say, well, what are you going to bring to the party? You're going to post down here. What are you going to bring to the party? And so that actually gave them some time to think about, okay, what have I got to offer? And I think that got some buy-in, and it gave them some meaning to, okay, why I'm down there. And now, look, happy to say, even a few years later, and I still speak to the guys a lot, it's guys are actively trying to get there now so they can have their piece of the pie and that, and have a say in who comes in the door, how they're trained. And it's an awesome learning opportunity down there. One of the things we did over the years, so, I was there in 2009, and then for a bunch of reasons, ended up being sort of fast-tracked into an SSM position, but then went, asked to go back there and sort of finish what I started, and end up spending a 4-year stint in battle troop. But part I wanted to change was that, getting the guys to understanding the why, educating them more on why training's so important, and, and as we discussed earlier, the guys were just taking it, run with it, and just taking it to the next level. So, guys that come out a lot of those courses are doing spectacularly well. What took me years and years to experience or learn, these guys do in a couple of years, and they are just next level, and it's just great to see that. So, but to implement that system and training, I had to stay in the same job for like nearly 4 or 5 years, which is not usually done in the military. You usually every 2, maybe 3 years, you bounce around in different positions. But for that type of thing, you've got to stay there and build that capability, because I could roll out, the next person comes in, they don't understand it, and you're almost back to square one. So look, awesome opportunity. Again, I was surrounded by a bunch of good blokes that helped me out do that, and all the guys subsequently have just taken it and run with it and done an awesome job. So,
and for you, as you say, it's supposed to be a bit of a break, but it actually didn't turn out to be a break.
No, look, and I think most guys, I was just saying that the other day, I was in visiting, and I said, the blokes think they're coming down to OSS. In the old days, I'll take a bit of time out of the squadron, but most of the time it's busier than the squadron, not so much from a physical perspective, from an administrative and a mental perspective. You used to do a bunch of courses, you assist on a bunch of courses, and and that type of bloke that goes down there doesn't want to be sitting around bored. So they'll get in and, is there anything going? Yeah, I'll come and help out on that. So OSS, I think it's called SRW now, very, very busy.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you do that year, mate, and then in 2010 you post back on to CT duties, but you then deploy again to Afghan, and as you mentioned, 07 to 010, the war's changed again. The mission and as you said, you wish you had a clone, someone that could have gone. And how different was it from 07 to 2010?
Yeah, well, significantly different. But again, being in battle troop at the time, we were getting regular feedback, and they had a really good relationship with the guys there, and they would feed stuff back in. So we were implementing that in the training, as quickly as we could. So we had an understanding, some of the guys would rotate back in, they'd come and help. We'd actually see that in a training environment. But so that was a really interesting one, going back in the 2010. It was a surge. So at the time, felt like we're getting, a good upper hand on getting that, we talked about that onion ring effect, so building some, not sure what you call it, building some freedom of action for our mentoring and reconstruction task force. So they wanted to put some additional effort in it. It's something that hadn't been done. So the OCs at the time, CO, pushed to get an additional squadron in at the same time. And for those that don't know, Defence has a really strict cap on how many people we send away at any one time, and they are super strict on it, on the numbers there. So to get that across the line was a lot of administrative work. But so we went out and basically went through all the deployment stuff, and then I think we went out and surged for about 5, no longer than 6 weeks. So I went out there, to see what had evolved from a tactical capability of the squadrons was, hard to put it in words, but how they operated. Obviously, the helos were there then. Just the equipment, and again, most of this was modifications the blokes were doing, not equipment we were getting, because that was just a very, very slow process again. But yeah, to see how far that had moved forward, how the guys had evolved that, and by this time we'd moved, probably the biggest jump, and I talk about this a lot, is we'd moved from nighttime to daylight operations.
And I do want to talk about this.
Yeah, and yeah, look, happy to discuss it as much as you like, because it's a big bugbear of mine. There was no consultation. Karzai had made a decree that, there was to be no more nighttime operations, and but none of our senior leadership discussed that with us. None of us supported, and that rule was made for a particular reason. They were talking about large-scale clearances of villages, which, as you'd expect, upset the locals a lot. So it was mainly aimed at that. So the UK and the US Special Forces groups, they didn't do that. If anything, they upped the ante, because you're only hitting maybe one or two houses, and a lot of times you could get in and out without even being noticed. But we were forced to go to daylight, so the guys literally had to change on the fly, and that took away any advantage we had. And I've said openly, that decision has cost Australian lives. And again, probably the dog capability was the thing that we didn't take more. Again, at no time were we consulted in that. At no time did anyone say, what are the consequences of doing this? Look, if we had been told, we probably went, yeah, all right, yeah, yeah, we'll do it. Here's the risks. And the blokes would probably crack on. But to sit there and have the senior leadership say, it didn't add any risk is just rubbish.
Well, it's bullshit. No, I'll call that out. It's absolute bullshit, because, mate, you own the night against the Taliban with our night vision and the capability that you could stealth in, do the job, bang, muzzles it.
Yep.
Like, hey, mate, come with us. How to say that's not a heightened risk in the daytime? And unfortunately, a couple of the guys were lost.
Yeah, well, that direct question was asked to Angus Campbell during question time in the Senate estimates, and he sat there and said he couldn't answer, and thought it wasn't an additional risk, but not just a risk to us, but it's a risk to the local community, the local Afghan community. If you've got bad guys there and we're targeting, then the local population gets caught up in that. Especially as we've mentioned, we used to get in a firefight most of the time. Even with helicopters, they'd know we're coming. Any advantage, as you mentioned, was taken away from us. So it just about leveled the playing field. But we're just lucky that we had some good training and we had that opportunity to evolve. And the guys did an amazing job. We had a mature dog capability at that stage. So, and again, I'm only talking about typically one dog within a troop. So that dog couldn't cover everything. Of course. So yeah, we're just amazing. We didn't lose more life.
And I've listened to so many other episodes with Chalky and so many other guys, and Jason Brown, who was unfortunately killed, that might have, if it wasn't daylight ops, he might still be here, and as again, hindsight's a wonderful thing, but I just like to have, as you mentioned, and I'll say it anyway, because to say that Campbell would say there's no heightened, he doesn't see that there's a heightened risk. Is he under a rock?
Well, he's in another country, mate.
So, well, that's true.
He's making that decision from shining his seat with his ass.
Yeah.
So look, and this is part of the problem we're talking about now. And I know we'll get to the doco stuff, but if you're going to make that, just do the courtesy of asking the bloke that's going out on the ground every day. And look, that's the old way wars were fought. In this day and age, you would expect, hey, look, you're getting into combat every day. What are the consequences of making this decision, to do that, but to not be asked and then not say, okay, well, look, we're not going to help you out. It's just, it sucks.
And as you say, too, you've got to evolve on the fly. Like, okay, well, hang on, what does daylight operations look like compared to going in at night? Like, and in the middle of a war, it's just wild.
Yeah, and that's testament to the training and the blokes. I'll just make it work, but having those conversations, when you're out there fighting the day, it gives you, you are feeling less safe. You realise you don't have the advantage anymore, so you have to take risks that you would never have normally taken. So, yeah, But again, the guys did an amazing job and look, got really good at it. So,
and at this point too, is this where the partner force is changing as well, from when you were there in 07 to starting to ramp up with 50-50, or is that a little bit later?
We had the same partnering force the whole time, but one of the other, handbrakes we had, or the additional elements of the challenge of dealing with was, the partnering force ratio. So as the war evolved, the partnership ratio got greater and greater, and again that was more designed for regular forces, not special forces. You imagine we roll out with 20 odd blokes, half of them have to be Afghan police who, look, let's put it bluntly, they were useless. We actually had to allocate guys to look after them, so that took away from the fighting force, and you're landing in the bad guy's backyard. Just, I think, and I wasn't there for this one, but I think it got to 2012-13, the blokes were telling me that by then it got to about 50%. So that was just, from a risk perspective, that was unachievable for us. So used to send the Afghan force out first, but wherever they got dropped with that's where the guys would come, and they'd still be sitting there. Bad guys had run off. So, it was just a shambles by then. But again, forcing us to do that without understanding the ramifications of that, it's just poor leadership.
Absolutely. Yeah. So now I can see why, and I can see from your perspective frustration too of, and the handbrakes constantly being applied, but all for you guys for pushing forward the best you could. And as you said, and when you said it throughout the podcast, is that just trying to do the best you can with what you had.
Yeah. And you can imagine the amount of pressure that puts on blokes. Like, you're there, 1 minute you're fighting at night, catching bad guys, next minute you're fighting in day and you're fighting for your life, then you start thinking about, is this worth it, or is this, the risk that's to you and your family? So, you can start second guessing yourself for sure. So not a great spot to be in, but again, to their credit, guys pushed on with that. But yeah, it's just it's hard to swallow.
Of course.
when you're put in that situation, and then you're explaining to someone, why were you out there in the daylight?
And especially the non-military people too, going, what? Why? Hang on, we're supposed to. Knife's your friend.
Yeah, why aren't you using the technology we've paid for?
Exactly, and also too, mate. In hindsight, looking at it now, do you wish the leadership had stood up and said, no, we're going to stay like the Americans and the British, and we're actually going to crack on and continue our night ops because we were owning our night ops?
And look, to be fair, the short answer is yes, but again, at my level, it's hard to understand the politics at play at the strategic, and probably the political level. But again, if you're sitting, 1,600 kilometres away in another country, and you're not involved in those chats directly, it's hard to make one of those decisions, I suppose, effectively. So, let alone with us and the people who are making that decision. But we had in Kabul, we had a SO command, ISAF, Special Forces Command. We had people there that could represent that, but I don't think anyone even talked to them. So look, I'm not going to sit here and say I understand all that. I've got my opinion on it, and I hear about it. But look, I mean, there's the political level at play there, and again, just understanding that, you're never going to understand it fully. But just again, ask the question.
Of course. And I'll bring this in now because I think it leads in really well. Is at that point when you're there in 2010, did you feel that it was now starting to get that? What is the overall objective, and like, can anyone see that we're going to win this? Or
look, and I'll probably only speak on my behalf,
of course,
and the blokes I've spoken to. So there's a group there. I believe at that stage, we sort of said, well, this is not going to work. We talked about the stuff we mentioned previously. What's the exit strategy? If they're going to, is one very much at a senior level, they seemed lost. Okay, what do we do next? So from that perspective, and I'm talking SOTG, Special Operations, Task Group, we're going to go out and do this job, and we'll continue to do it until you tell us not to. But it felt like at a senior leadership level, it's just a game to them, that's people's lives you're playing that game with.
Absolutely.
So, if they knew they were going to withdraw, or they knew, there wasn't a clear route out of this, why continue to send us out, all the time? Not one general visited, and there was a lot that visited and said, hey, fellas, why don't you slow down a bit? Because, no one was... And we probably would have said, get stuffed anyway, because, as you know, there were still other Australians there, so while they were there, we were going to do that. But, honestly, probably after my second or maybe into the third rotation, mate, I obviously cared for the Afghan people, but my sole focus was Australians on the ground. So, like, how do I protect them and get them home? And, I've said it before and I'll say it again, we took that really, really seriously. So if something got through, or an Australian soldier was injured or worse, killed, that was a bad day for us. I mean, a really, really bad day. It pissed us off. So, we wanted to go out and do more. We were limited with assets, really. So.
And in this time, in 2010, 2011, when we'll get to your fourth trip, this is the two biggest years that Australians suffer their most casualties in the war. So we're starting to lose more and more guys on the ground. And as you say, by your third rotation, yes, you care, okay, for the Afghan people, but it's these guys that are getting killed that you're more, and you take it personally.
Most definitely. And look, and I should know, but the statistics, and we used to get them, reasonably regularly, of Afghan, civilians losing their lives was just appalling. And look, unfortunately, a lot of that was through Taliban, but some of it was through coalition as well. So just really, really bad to hear. But again, that was at the time, that was across Afghanistan. So we were doing the best we could to protect them with what they were, but as I said, our target was to target Taliban networks, leadership, and break that down. Now we're in daylight ops, and they would be in villages, sort of threatening the locals to do what they wanted. The only way we could go on was to get them, but as we've touched on, that put everyone at a greater risk. So, and then where you could, you'd try and avoid Australians that were working there, but at that stage, I think around that 2011-12, there was a lot of FOB set up.
Yep. And
I think we were, again, Australia were transitioning away from that model as well. So just got very, very complex, mate.
Well, and this, I'll jump forward to your 2011 trip now, and I'm in quoted commas, which has been in the media so many times, this as what has changed, the mission profile is quoted, kill capture, in the media. I'm using that term as you...
No, that's what it was.
Yeah, so, mate, talk me through that in the sense that 07, when you were there, to now 11, had changed.
Yeah, look, and I couldn't tell you exactly when that verbiage came in from a mission set. Every job you go at has a mission, and it became very standardised, and it was kill capture. And look, I think there was a lot of debate about it. A lot of people wanted to change it to capture kill, really semantics, I suppose, but ultimately we stuck with the kill capture because, even though we had the ability to capture them, if they wanted to fight, we wanted the guy's mindset to be the first thing is self-preservation, protect life, so, kill the bad guy. But if we stuck it the other way around, there'd be subconsciously, an additional effort. I've got to capture this guy. So, it was just almost a play on words. But so look, we ended up leaving it as kill capture. A lot of people didn't like it, but that was part of that preservation model. It was part of that psyche, and making sure the guys that were going out and do that job day to day had the right mindset. And again, most people don't understand, but and look, I couldn't give you a percentage, but the majority of people we caught and brought back into the system for under the guidance we had to go out and target that individual. We would a lot of times we captured them and then put them in the system, and that's something we could talk about, but the system wasn't set up to hold on to those people, so consequently we'd give them $50 and put them in a cab and off they'd go, and we'd target them again another day. So a lot of people don't understand that, but they knew that. They knew if they didn't put up a fight, didn't say anything, once we captured them, put them in the system, get let go back to the village, and they'd just go around that cycle. Hence I use that term, we were playing games, but it took us 11 years to get a detention facility. We couldn't put them in with the Dutch because they'd hand them over to the NDS, and they had some human rights accusations against them. The Yanks wouldn't take them unless they were a high-value target. So we'd go out and do their jobs, and, I think it got coined that, catch and release. So we'd go and get them. But again, every time you do that, you're risking your life, you're risking assets, you're risking Afghan lives. So it just, as I said, it became a bit of a game, which was just hard to put up with. So
for the non-listener, mate, and this, because you were involved in this, that's why I want to do a bit of a deep dive, so for these to become kill capture, do they get onto the JPEL? Like, is that how it worked? Can you explain how that worked?
Yeah, so just a bit of background. You have to do, or as a bad guy, you have to report derogatorily. So you talk about killing coalition forces, locals, running drugs, running guns. So you have to be doing bad stuff to get above the threshold. At the time, you had to do that for 30 days continuously. So if you did it for 29 and then you lost your phone or didn't charge your battery, you would drop off that list. But look, there was plenty of people on that list, some in country, some out of country. But once you're on it, you were put on the JPEL, so the Joint Priorities Effects List, and then we could legitimately target you. And that was through a bunch of evidentiary, or through an evidentiary chain. So a lot of it was almost like a policing action, So we'd use fingerprints, we'd use retinal scans. A lot of our SOA guys managed that for us, and we had a big database. So we spent an awful lot of time. You might develop a target over 6 or 12 months. It might happen in a day too, but typically it was a slow burn. But you always had these guys lined up. And once they were green, you would provide that brief to the senior leader, well, not senior leadership, but to your seniors, and they would say, yep, that individual was clear to target. There was a couple of ways that could happen. They could use a drone and drop a bomb on them. If we had a thing called CDE, collateral damage estimate. So if you were able to drop a bomb on them and neutralise that or eliminate that individual, you had to ensure that there was less than a certain amount of civilians that would be at risk or get killed. If you couldn't do that, they would send us out to target that individual. So whether it be by vehicle or whether it be by helicopter. So we would go out, conduct the target. Sometimes you capture them, sometimes it would end up in a firefight, they would be killed, or sometimes they just weren't there. But that's the cycle, that continuous cycle that went on. But the evidence that we used to use to put them under JPEL, it didn't sit or in alignment with the Afghan rule of law. So, and look, there was some smart lawyers there that were trying to train them up and get them to understand it and move to that system. So how we were targeting here would then equate to how we would prosecute them. But that never matured, I don't believe. It didn't mature fast enough. So, like I said, unless they were a high value target, the US took them, they were just released. So
to get to fight another day.
Yeah. Well, some guys I think we caught up to about 4 times. So
it's just it's just wild. I mean, we could talk for another 4 hours on it, but we won't, because I know you've got
don't want to bore the listener.
Yeah. So, mate, you come back from your 4th and final trip, and then you go back to battle troop, as you mentioned, from 2012 to 2015. And is this, obviously you're proud of your whole career, but this part of the next few years, is this a real, like, you look on that as a really rewarding part of your career?
Yeah, very much so, mate. So, we touched on me trying to educate myself about how we train people better and get improvements. We're always striving for improvements to make the next guy that comes through better than the last. So I was studying that time, I had a much clearer. I had some time to talk about ideas that I'd tried to implement previously that didn't go well. Managed to surround myself with some really, really good guys to help me out and build that. And then as we developed that, we took some stuff out of the US, took some stuff from Canada, and built that. We were getting extraordinary results. And I mean, if you want to talk from a basic shooting concept, over a week, from accuracy, speed, and efficacy, we can improve people 300 to 500%.
Wow.
Yeah, and you've got to continue to train that to maintain it. But yeah, we were thinking, geez, are we getting this wrong? And we were very lucky to have a DSTG scientist there with us, and he's like, no, Weeksy, you're working it out correctly. Actually, I was working it out wrong. I thought it was 30 to 50%. He said, no, it's 300 to 500%. So we're going, oh, look, this is too good to keep to ourselves. If you carry a firearm and you're in defence, you should have access to this training. At the time, Bezo was the commanding officer. I put it to him and said, hey, can we go out and share some of the love? And he was very supportive of it, actually. So the blokes that were helping me, I don't know if they were that keen about it, but we travelled all over Australia, all to a lot of the battalions, and then we were using shooting as the mechanism, but the actual methodology we were trying to teach, or the underpinning methodology, was the training piece, like how to train humans well. If I train you to do, if I train you to train well, you can use it for anything. So look, we ran around Army doing all that. Got there was the initial pushback through defence and Army, and fun enough, I think there still is these days. But there's some great stuff going on out there now, and there's some really sharp young infantry warrant officers and sergeants, or even corporals, are doing an amazing job with this stuff, and then that sort of slowly bled into other bits. So I think that had an amazing effect on predominantly infantry, but I think it's spread out through some areas of defence. But yeah, for me personally, I suppose, just to be able to do that and help improve that, and it's just been very humbling and very nice. But I still get guys sending me messages or writing me letters saying, hey, Weeksy, I'm reading a lot more now, I'm implementing this, or I've looked at this training and I want to do X, Y, and Z with the training to make it better. So yeah, that still happens to this day. So from that, it's amazing to see. And again, defence is full of really, really keen young individuals. And this is probably where I have my problem with defence, is, like we stifle that. I don't think they like them thinking. So, but, some brilliant young individuals there that, can go to next level. And, I think I said at the Chief of Army at some stage, like part of the recruiting problem we're having, what's on the box or what's advertised on the box is not what's in the packet. Yeah, and, unfortunately, a lot of the young people that come in look at it and go, well, this is not really what I was expecting, and then get out very soon thereafter, sadly. But, Army can be a great career.
Absolutely. And I think too, mate, what higher up defence need to understand, and I'm speaking from a civilian's perspective, is that you're not dealing with uneducated people. Like, a digger now is not uneducated. Like, they are very, very capable, smart, intelligent, make decisions that. So treat them with that respect. Don't treat them like they are idiots.
Yeah, correct, mate. Well said.
And that's from a civilian, mate. So
yeah, look, and as an institution, that's hard to shake that one off. Look, we're getting there, and I see elements of defence that that are amazing, but there's still some pockets of resistance. But I talk about tradition versus stewardship. Unfortunately, the Army still lives a lot of tradition, and look, and I can understand why, but geez, that slows us down. Whereas stewardship, look after it, yeah, great. Provide it where it's needed, but let the younger guys and girls move on. Let them take defence to the next level.
Absolutely, that's exactly right. And so you're there from 2012 to 2015, and in 2016, mate, you take a bit of a side posting. This one down to you post into the Adelaide University Regiment.
Yep. Yes.
Where did this come from?
So it was a SOCOMAND directive. Basically, if you wanted to be competitive to remain within SOCOMAND and be a regimental sergeant major in that position, you had to take a posting outside of SOCOMAND itself. Look, this was, I think it was Jeff Singelman, or maybe his predecessor, that sort of brought this into play. So yeah, look, at the time I didn't know what it was, didn't know where I was going, and I thought, well, how's this going to help me in my eventual SOCOMAND career? But look, it was a great 2 years, and I'll be honest, it didn't really help me with my SOCOMAND career, but from a special forces perspective. But from seeing a different side of defence, and it was a reserve unit, seeing some of the young guys and girls there going through officer training was nothing short of eye-opening. I think there was a number of there. We had PhD students, we had science graduates, other uni students, people coming from high school, out of high school, but committing their spare time to defence as a reservist, because they had a different career but wanted to be part of defence. So that was awesome to see. And look, and I was married unaccompanied at the time. My wife Lindsay and my daughter Emma stayed in Perth, and my daughter was year 11, going to year 11. So the decision to leave them and stay, which was bloody hard, mate.
Of course.
I'd spent nearly half my daughter's life. So by the time she was 16 or 17, I'd been away for 8 years of that. So to go on post unaccompanied, somewhere I didn't know, that was hard to take. But look, tried to catch up with them as much as possible. But so I had a lot of spare time, did some more study, but also threw as much as I could into that unit. But that also helped me go out and also help develop some of the battalions, again, with the shooting, the training, the learning. So again, a good opportunity, mate. Like I said, probably didn't help me from a SOCOMAND perspective, but definitely in a whole bunch of other areas. It was really good, and just amazing young people doing the best with what they had. Like a lot of times 2 division or 2nd division reserves, they're underfunded in a lot of areas, so getting the right people to move that ahead is hard work for them, but they crack on and do a great job.
So in a sense, it really, as you say, didn't really help you in your SOCOMAND, but it was a good 2 years in its own right.
Yeah, most definitely. And but that was one of those things you had to do to come back and be competitive, to be an RSM in a SOCOMAND unit. And then fortunately for me, that worked out, and I came back as the RSM of SASR. So
yeah, we'll talk about that now, mate. So in 2018, you come back as RSM of SASR, and did you, when you joined the army, mate, back in 1988, and did you ever foresee that you would be the RSM of the most elite unit in Australia?
No, I didn't. Mate, if you had asked me that question 3 or 4 years before it actually happened, I still wouldn't have said no. Yeah, I think I'm a bit naive like that. So when I was, you do your job, you do the best you can with your job, and and there's certain pathways that you'll end up taking through your career that eventually lead to becoming an RSM. But at the time, I didn't look at them that way. So not that it's a factor, but doing an overseas posting and doing well, coming back. And as I think I mentioned, and we didn't really go into it, but I was in battle trip for a year, but then something occurred where that SSM of that squadron was removed, and sort of there was a couple of us, in line for that. But I didn't consider myself. I thought I was about 3rd or 4th down the line, but got bumped up and took over that squadron as the SSM, which really, at the time, I didn't want to do that. I was like, to the RSM at the time, I was like, do I get a say in it? He went, nah. So off I went. And look, and I had probably, if I'm honest, I had a pretty shitty attitude about that. I wanted to get battle troop to where I wanted to get it to, but look, that was actually, it worked out really, really well. I went into an awesome squadron, probably, awesome bunch of blokes, great leadership, and had a brilliant 2 years there. And then, but then all of a sudden, you're in that line of work where it sets you up to be the RSM. So, and like I said, at the time I wasn't really considering it, but yeah, lo and behold. And look, but when I found out, that I was potentially in line for that, I thought, well, whether I get it or I don't, I've got to be prepared. And I don't know if you can ever be fully prepared, but I put a shit ton of effort into, okay, what have I seen before me? What would I like to see? And then, and I actually built a bunch of, I won't call them strategies, but a bunch of ideas. And, I went to a bunch of mates and I said, hey, if I become one of those RSMs we don't like, you need to kick me in the arse and let me know ASAP. And to their credit, they did it. But, and it's a strange position, mate, because, I've had good friends that became very distant, and then I've had other guys that you knew as operators that become RSM and, just, went completely different in how you saw it in your head or in my head, what you'd pictured. But so I had all those, and look, mate, I'd like to think I did a pretty good job at it. It was in a tough time because that's when the IGADF started coming around, and I was an RSM, and we were at that point where we were notifying guys that had to go and do interviews, so that detracted from it a bit. But as far as the actual job, I was always cognizant I want to get out and do some work with the guys, do PT with the guys and the girls, obviously do your job well. There's a lot of representational duties in that role, so representing that well, maintain that knowledge focus, wanting to learn all the time. But you very quickly, the unit's probably when it's full, it's about 700 strong. So, and it covers a massively diverse range of things, from everything from running selections to operational to some secret squirrel shit to the logistics support, our specialists, our support staff. And so breaking that up evenly and getting around, all those guys and girls that make that unit tick, it's a big day every day.
And for you, because like you want to get out and see the guys, did you have to come in earlier to like?
Yeah, mate. My wife and daughter again suffered for that at the time, but I'd typically leave 5:30 or 6, try and go and do some PT. Normally I'd check the emails, make sure there wasn't anything super important, go and do some PT. And I used to try and get PT in before the majority turned up, because otherwise you get just chest poked the whole time. You never get any PT in. Go back, and again, we had, SASR's the only unit level command where you get your own EA. And she was great in the fact that, she'd organise your days, like do all your meetings here, leave me a few spare hours to get out and see the guys and the girls, and then back into meetings in the afternoon. And then by the time you get home, it was usually late. You're usually getting home for dinner if you're lucky. So, 12, 13-hour days regularly. But there was a ton of travel. I think first year, 67 or 68 flights backwards and forwards across Australia. And then I think the next year was similar. But that was international travel as well. So, trying to keep the CO on the straight and narrow, trying to look after him, give the right advice. Yep. So yeah.
For our non-military, and like I'm civilian, so are you the bridge between the CO and the other ranks? Is that how the
very much
RSM
so,
works?
Very much so. And I got in trouble for this because I took a very different view to that. but yes, is the short answer. But there's a line in your reporting where it says provide frank and fearless advice to the commanding officer. But a lot of COs don't like hearing that. So, and look, in that unit, it's very good because the blokes will come up and tell the CO exactly what he doesn't want to hear anyway. Yep. So, but I suppose you're a bit of that filter. You try and stop some of the dumb stuff coming down to the blokes, or or rationalising it, and then saying everyone wants a piece of the commanding officer. So it's just managing that, and that's. But again, it's most of the time it's a really good relationship from that side of the house. So yeah, look. Yeah, as I said, as an RSM, you're an advisor. The commanding officer's the guy that makes the decisions, and he gets to live with them, and you just try and give him that best advice you can. So, but yeah, look, both commanding officers I had, I feel like I had a really good relationship with. Some really testing times around that IGADF side of the house.
Yeah,
but it went well.
I'll just touch on that briefly with, especially you, like, that would have been a hard time any time being the RSM is hard, but around that would have been really tough. And did you just have to try and support the guys as best you could?
Yeah, mate. But probably the thing that pissed me off the most was I wasn't getting any information at SO Command on how to deal with this. You know, like, we're all in the same boat. It was new to everyone. But simple things for, you know, when a young bloke could have to turn up for an interview, you know, we didn't have a list of support officers, we didn't have a list of legal officers. I couldn't really tell the young bloke what he was getting into, what he could or couldn't say. Like, that did come later on. But, you know, I was going back to SO Command saying, hey, is this my job as a unit RSM? You know, I had my XO as well, who was an absolute legend. You know, we had the S1, and she was fantastic. But, you know, we're like, what do you want us to do with this, you know? And they're like, no, that's our job. We're like, well, how about you hurry up and provide us some of that information, what we can. And so, yeah, that was hard because, you know, I'm sitting there trying to do the best thing by the blokes, and they weren't allowed to say no. They had to go and do the interview. So, look, that was really, really poorly run from the IGADF's perspective, but also from a SO Command perspective. It was just, it left the guys open massively, you know, and I think we're in some of the shit fight we're in now because that just wasn't run well at the beginning. And
as you mentioned too, fog of war is, you know, like you're trying to remember things that happen over multiple. Yeah,
look, and look, I'm happy to say it. Burton went way outside his remit, you know. So he was given a set of initial guidelines. He was employed to stand that thing up, but it almost took on a life of its own. And I mean, I remember, you know, asking the question a number of times, like, well, when's this going to stop? You know, like, when has it become, you know, what it was requested to do to now, you know, 4 years later, this is still going on. You know, and the answer was, oh, well, you know, it's out of our hands now. I'm going, well, you started this bloody thing. So how about, you know, you have some saying, or did you go into it with no clue whatsoever, which I think they did. But started something that just, you know, couldn't be stopped. And then, you know, I said, Burton went completely off the reservation. And I think we've seen some, you know, independent reviews of that now and where that's gone wrong. But, mate, there's still a phenomenal amount of people, you know, what are we, 8-9 years later or something like that? Only one bloke's been charged, and that's still ongoing. And that is just horrendous for his family and, you know, his kids, like that, just being tortured. And, you know, this is a guy that served his country for 20 years, put his life on the line, and now, you know, if he's done something wrong, there's a way to go about it. But the way it's happened with the OSI is just diabolical. And the shit that his family is going through, you know, common criminals, like real criminals, you know, wouldn't be treated that way. So it's just it's pathetic.
The balance of power is so wrong because actual criminals are getting and as we say too, if there is evidence there, of course, you know. But
there's a way to doing business.
There's a way to do it, and there's a way not to do it. And like, come on, like, like, let's you know.
And you know, like you know, I was fortunate enough to meet Peter Dutton when he set up the OSI. But what he set it up to be and what it is now is two completely different things. And I don't know these individuals, but you've got to ask the question, you know, and if you want to go out and dig and have a look, they are spending a ton of money on these guys investigating stuff. And the whole idea, the original premise was have a look at something. If it had no merit to go to court, get rid of it as quickly as possible. This has been dragging on for a long time. Those people are earning a ton of money. So it's not in their interest to do it quickly, is it?
Of course.
So, yeah, just hurry up.
Well, that's how I've got a couple of lawyer friends and they say the same thing. We'll keep the case going as long as it's in our interest because who pays for it?
Exactly, taxpayer.
Exactly right. So you, and as you say, you weren't one to go on tradition. You sort of moulded into the way you thought an RSM, and you were doing a good job and as best you could in those times. And at this, and I know we'll get into the doco and that in a minute, but in 2020 you did some study, so you actually went on and further studied and
finished my degree.
Finished your degree, And how was that? Was that a good thing to?
Yeah, mate. So I was always going to, at that point, I was always going to take some time off. I think I'd done over 30 years, not taking any leave. So the plan was always after that RSM time, once I knew that was occurring, was just take some time, spend some time with family, but finish off some study. And then, it was probably somewhere through it was good. It was a good break, but it was probably halfway through that period I found out that, they didn't want me in that career anymore. And look, my senior commander at the time, like say 2 levels up, he just wrote me a really poor report for all the wrong reasons, and that's probably something I wish I had fought a bit harder, but basically it just left me with very, very few options about staying within SO Command or even, posting somewhere that I wanted to go in the next stage of my career. So it was about the middle of there that I chose that, I discharged from the military.
So essentially, mate, after 30 years, or 30 plus years, multiple deployments around the world, RSM, and this is where the ADF has gone, I think it's gone the wrong way, and you were in the position I wasn't. We went away from what the core army does, that the job is to fight wars. That's the warfighter mentality that is now in question of all the crap that's going on. Essentially, you were pushed out of the army.
Pretty much, mate. Yeah. Spot on. Yeah. Look, I mean, I had a choice, just wasn't much of a choice. That's all. So, and at the time of my life, it sort of drove me down a road to choose another path, I suppose. And I take sort of a pragmatic view of that. I was very fortunate that I enjoyed my career. I had an amazing career for the time I had. So I chose the path I chose, and I can live with that. But then if you translate that to all the other blokes, and there's nearly 200 of them, they're in the prime of their career. So these are young corporals or even troopers and diggers now, which never was the case in SASR, but especially corporals, sergeants, hundreds and hundreds of years worth of combat experience, training experience, that just pretty much weren't either given the option or conditions were that bad. They were just pushed out of the system. And, and a lot of those guys are mentally struggling with that because they still wanted to serve their country. They were just, they were statistics basically. It's like we don't need them in there. We want to clear as much of that away as possible, or that part of defence history or army history. And so pushed a ton of really, really capable young men out of there, and they're in the civilian world now trying to do the best they can, but and I can pretty much say they're feeling pretty bad because they wanted to serve their country but weren't given that opportunity.
And what I'm hearing again throughout the whole podcast is it's almost going back to the 96 disaster, where you lose hundreds of years of combat experience, training, and the unit's got to start again, essentially.
Yeah, that was an accident, but this was done on purpose.
Yeah.
So, Army's just not following its own values, and that's, I probably can't put it any simpler way, they're not living their own values. And, one of my best mates left for that reason. We're getting it rammed down our throats. And to give you an example, we're at war for 20 years. So, 2000 to 2020. In 2022, Defence decides to put out its morals and ethics directive. So, hey fellas, why couldn't you have done that prior? Did it take you that long to see it, or but they're ramming that down our throats, yet not living themselves. Just poor form, really.
Oh, of course, mate, absolutely. And for you, as you said, you had a distinguished career, and at that point, did you feel that you'd lost your purpose, or you always had, obviously you'd gone on and done some study and you had an idea, getting into the civilian world after 30 plus years of being in the military, was it hard to find purpose again?
Yeah, look, I suppose probably goes right back to the start, mate, when you were talking about I'm pretty laid back.
Yeah.
So, just taking a logical perspective of where does that leave me, and doing a bit of analysis on, okay, what options have I got? Again, I took that approach, I got better at that as I went through the military, so I was like, okay, what is out there, what can I do, and having that year off, I suppose, and studying and looking around, and part of the transition out of defence, they actually give you an option to go out and do some, I'll call it on-the-job training, but you can go on with a company and do 10 days work experience, I suppose, see what you like. So I was fortunate enough to do that, and I'm still working for that company today. But my boss is an ex-military guy, and he understood how the transition goes for defence people. So we have an EAP provider, and one of those guys, he came and I spent every couple of months I'd spend some time with him having a chat about that transition between civilian and defence. So I had a lot of support. A lot of people that go into civilian organisations don't get that or don't understand that, and consequently it takes them a while to find their feet. So look, I was fortunate in that way. The more I look back on it now, as I said before, I wish I had fought that decision a little bit harder for a number of reasons. But like I said, I really enjoyed my time. I was very fortunate when I was in and did a ton of great stuff, met a ton of great people. And, but I sit here and I think, I look at defence now and I'm just like, far out as, it can be and it should be, such an awesome opportunity, whether you want to do your 4 years or whether you want to spend 30 years in there. But, you sort of look at it now and you're like, I struggle to sit there, and I have people, ask me regularly, I want my son to go in the military, and I'm like, just pause on it for a little while. But I mean, I know that's not the answer. So, and again, I can talk from an infantry perspective. It's not hard to keep a young soldier happy, and getting to do stuff that they love and want to do. It's actually really, really simple. But, for whatever reason, we're stuffing it up. So,
and you actually, as you said, were lucky to find that, have that opportunity, and you are Executive Risk Solutions as COO.
Yep.
And is that where you're still currently today?
Still in that role, yeah. So, awesome company. I said my mate was ex-military. He's the founder of the company. Sort of through that opportunity, so I went and did some work experience with him. At the end of that, he's like, yep, jump on board if you want. So I did some consulting, ended up, in that company, did the general manager role for a little while just to understand what's going on. Now sitting as the COO, and again, it's a very diverse company, and look, it's growing rapidly. So, I think we've got 500 about 500 employees. It's a lot.
Yeah, right.
So, and again, across multiple disciplines, so keeping track of that, and I'm still learning about the civilian world, the corporate world. So it's always challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. And mate, this is where we're going to get into. Then there's a few final questions after this one, and then, as I say, it's just been an absolute privilege to sit with you. And recently, you were involved in the documentary Bravery and Betrayal. Now, for our non-military listeners out there, mate, can you talk us through, and it's the reason I wanted to get you on the podcast, is to talk about the Bravery and Betrayal documentary, which is about to be released the day after Anzac Day, and on the 26th, on Saturday. And, just talk us through that. Yeah, look,
it goes back to a lot of the frustrations you've probably heard me talking about here, So we talked about the daylight raids, the night to day, the lack of support, lack of consultation through senior leadership, the IJDF piece as well, to some extent. And I think initially I came up with the concept, I've actually written an academic paper about this, but getting it published is really difficult. But a lot of the concepts in there, that transfer of risk from the senior leadership to the soldier on the ground, these are all frustrations we're all talking about. And then again, I think it came through just as a discussion with a mate. I said, well, how do we change some of that narrative? And as you've heard, there's, a couple of individuals within the media don't seem to like defence at all, just taking a very dim view of it or taking it on themselves.
And our special forces,
Yeah. And just telling, I'll say half-truths, like they don't have all the information, we don't have all the information, yet they're making accusations that, that the general public get to hear. And it's just a very, very poor narrative about what went on in Afghanistan, especially within the SAS. So we were thinking, how do we get a different narrative out there? Not necessarily change what's there, but just something for the public to hear. And then we sort of talked about the concept of a documentary. What would be the best way to do it in this day and age? So one thing led to another, and we ended up, one of our mates, he was sort of linked in with making Red Dog. He's one of our dog handlers. The producer of that knew another bloke, and he said, well, why don't you try this guy? His name's Simon Heath. So he's the gentleman that's producing this for us. So he sort of lived a similar battle with his dad through Vietnam, so he sort of saw that. So there was that link for us. We all met up, talked about if we were going to do it, how it would go and how we would do that. And then 18 months, nearly 2 years later, here we are. A lot of work, again, a lot of time away from family to get it, but to try and get it right. I interviewed a lot of people, and again, I'd like to say, public, the amount of support from the general public that, we couldn't have done it without donations. So a lot of people have given up studio time, they've given up their own time to help us out, but the donations through Wandering Warriors, so we used Wandering Warriors to make sure everything was legitimate. That's a charity run by ex-defence members, so that a good support mechanism for us, and it sort of, as I said, legitimised where those donations were going, so we can track all that. And then we came up with the concept, and we talked about it a lot, but there's that bravery piece, which is the first half of the doco, which is just showing, gives everyone a good idea of what the blokes did, what the families went through, a bit of a tearjerker in some of them, and just understanding all that piece. And then sort of halfway through, we talk about that betrayal piece, which is pretty much talking about, how when things went wrong, that moral contract between your soldiers and senior leadership, where you're willing to go out and fight and do the business, and you win the battles, but you're expecting them to run the war effectively for you, and they just didn't do that. So, but then when things went wrong, they were nowhere to be found to stand up for the soldiers. So that's telling that sort of two-part story. Look, at this stage, I think it looks pretty good. So, and Simon's done a great job. Obviously, a ton of feedback from everyone that's instrumental in playing that or playing their part in that. Yeah, and it's, as you mentioned, the premiere's out the day after Anzac Day. We didn't want to take away from Anzac Day, and we've got a families and friends night following, but then it's going out through Eventbrite, through cinemas across Australia. And then we've got one individual who's, if for those who are familiar and old enough, he's doing a bit of an Albie Mangles tour around Australia. So Isuzu in West Park Auto, thank you very much. They've given us a car, and this guy, Mort, is going to drive around Australia and take it to regional Australia. So I want to give those the sort of our Australian friends across the country an opportunity to see it firsthand. And probably the thing that's unique about this one is at the end of each one there'll be someone there standing up at the end of it going, "Hey, ask me some questions," a bit like we're doing now, mate. So having that opportunity to ask the blokes that were there,
absolutely,
any questions, and why I think if they didn't, hopefully they will, but if there's something they don't want to understand, they want more clarification on, they can ask the blokes.
Are you hoping that a streaming service will pick it up as well?
Yeah, would love that. And the idea behind that is if someone picks it up and can roll it out, anything that comes from that, so we're not getting any money out of it. Everything will go to Wandering Warriors charity, and then that provides an amazing service for our veterans.
Absolutely, mate. And I think too what it is that it's great to actually cut the media, and I'll say it, cut the media bullshit out of it, and actually hear it from you guys that were on the ground. That's why I love doing the podcast too, mate, because you guys were there, we weren't. And so to hear it from your own your own words is, you can actually cut away the media spin and the narrative that the media try to put on things, and it's going to be a great thing for the general public. Yeah,
and totally agree, mate. I think this gives us the ability to say, well, this is what happened, and as we've sort of discussed over the last few hours, there's a whole bunch of limitations that you have to deal with and manage, as a soldier, and there are rules and regulations there. We were very tightly controlled, some of the information that was like, we made up our own concept of operations and we go out and we wouldn't ask permission. That just cannot happen. So you can't just go to the pilot and say, "Hey, can we just borrow the helicopter and zip off for a while and go on targets?" And people, but for some of those journalists to think that you can actually do that and not understand it, and look, and unfortunately, that might be all, your regular Australian, public hears, and so they've got to make a choice whether they believe it or not. Well, now there's the opportunity to hear it, as you said, for real, which, giving them the opportunity and to make an objective decision about how things work, but they hear it from the guys on the ground. So.
Absolutely. No, mate, I can't wait. I'm excited, and I'm looking forward to be invited over from you, mate. It's an honour and a privilege. So I really
Glad
appreciate
you could make
it. No, thank you. And mate, I want to talk about. We're nearly finished, and I know how precious your time is. So I want to talk about the thoughts on how you touched throughout the podcast how Afghanistan ended up, but through your involvement of Australia and from a perspective of what we achieved, and looking at it now, did we achieve our mission of fighting the war on terror?
Look, ultimately, no, mate. We got it wrong at a number of levels, and I'd love to sit here and say we did it well, but if we did, it'd be a different story. So, and all those things we touched on, through, what's our campaign plan going into this? You probably should have an exit strategy at the same time. If this drags on, you cannot fault like the Australian commitment as far as sending, soldiers, defence personnel to go and help the people out. I think that was genuinely, the right thing to do. And for what we did, and Australians are always good at this, they did an awesome job. I think if you go and speak to most of the Afghan population in our area, there'd be positive things. Unfortunately, as we've talked about, we just heard the negative stuff. But look, and I touched on it before, from the side of war, we won all the battles, yet we lost the war, but that's a general's job to manage that, and whether that be US, Australian, UK, or other allies, we stuffed it. So, and there's all the aftermath of that. So, and unfortunately, part of what we're talking about here is, the war crimes piece as well. So not only did we lose that, we've still got, our soldiers still facing that, and no one seems to be in a hurry to finalise it and get it done. And unfortunately, a lot of people are suffering for that. So, which just shouldn't be happening. But yeah, look, no, mate, we sadly we got it wrong. But even though we got it wrong, we got to see the good aspects of that as well. Learn from our mistakes, which is probably one of the other things for the documentary. It's like, if we end up in future wars, we want, part of this is, you'd love to think, our next level of leadership coming through will be prepared. They won't make the same mistakes. So, we'd love that to have an impact there as well. Whether it will or not, yet to be seen, but that's an idea.
And for you, because you had boots on the ground, mate, and I understand, and I did put this to Dan, and I did put this to Ian Langford as well. Looking back now, in your opinion, with 20 years of giving Afghanistan the freedom of what they had to fight the war on terror, was it all worth it?
Look, I think for me, yes. Personally, I think for a little while there, for 20 years, they had some more freedom than they do now under the Taliban Sharia law. And again, you only have to go back to the 70s and you have a look at what Afghanistan looked like prior to then, and then obviously the Russian invasion to now, there wouldn't be many of those people left around now that know what that freedom is. So I think to have an exposure to that, hopefully, that might spur something on in future to, say, well, we want more of that. Whether that happens in our lifetime, I'm not sure, mate. But I'd like to think, and I do think from my perspective, look, it was worth giving it a try. But did we succeed? No.
Yeah, and throughout the whole podcast, mate, that's what we've spoken about is Afghanistan has not been conquered. So, and to think that it was going to be conquered was maybe that hindsight might have. Yeah, hindsight is a wonderful thing. So, mate, I just quickly want to touch on the revoking of awards, and because you've had involvement in this of not directly, but people you know of, and just your opinion of what's happened.
Yeah, look, I think you'd put it down to, again, poor advice to the CDF at the time, and again, really poor management. Doesn't go with our values. I thought collective punishments went out the door a long, long time ago. Yeah. From trying to take the MUC off, thousands of individuals to, targeting, I think it's 9 now, and asking them to give up a medal when you're not willing to do it yourself. It's just disgraceful, especially when you were in command at the time. So, yeah, look, it's just hypocrisy. And again, another story for another time, but the honours and awards system is broken, well and truly broken, and needs a complete revamp. And I think they've started that process, which would be great to see. But, none of those individuals we're talking about deserve to have a medal removed at all.
No.
So I think it's wrong, mate.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, mate, I've got a couple of final questions, and then it's just been an absolute epic to sit here and just get your career. And it's very hard to try and compress 30 plus years into a 3.5 hour podcast. So, mate, knowing what you know now and all that you've been through, what advice would you give your 18-year-old self, and would he listen?
Well, I've got a 23-year-old daughter, and she doesn't listen, so I'm not sure if it's going to be worthwhile, but always back yourself. I think, we talked about it at the start, just having that confidence but humility linked with it is an awesome, set of traits to have. And probably the other one is always take time out to be objective. So I think I said, early in my career, there was an influence one of my sergeants had on me. Again, later on, one of my RSMs, Blue, if you're out there listening, one of the things he did really well was always took the time to get both sides of the story and the perspective. So, interesting enough, in the civilian world, it takes time. HR usually gets really upset with you, but just given the opportunity for everyone to have a say and then make an objective decision from there. So if I was going to pass that on to my daughter, which I have, yeah, definitely.
And I think, mate, I'm in my 30s now, and I can speak from experience of trying to tell a 18 to mid 20-year-old to and it's something that I reflected on when I wrote my book. Was my parents, and writing the book was really good because I did a lot of reflecting, and it was my parents were only trying to help me and to not make mistakes. And when you get into your 30s, you go, oh, they were actually had my best interest at heart. But in my 20s, I'm stoic and
doing my own thing.
Yeah, and unfortunately, so that's a great piece of advice. And for you, mate, looking back now with 30 plus years of serving your country, was joining the army still the best decision you've made?
Yes, mate, it was. I was very, very fortunate, just purely in timing. I've got mates that that served in that sort of quiet period, did a lot of time, spent a lot of effort, personal sacrifice, and sort of didn't go out to play the game, I suppose, if you want to call it that. But yeah, mate, it was, and just the diversity of people, opportunities that provided, things that set me up with, put me at a lot of risk a lot of times, and put you under a lot of pressure. But all of life is like that. So like anything, lots of great times, lots of really sad times, lots of ups and downs. Get to meet some amazing people, but also there's some knuckleheads in there as well. But do it all again, mate.
Absolutely. And mate, what advice do you have for any young person who is thinking of going down the SF route, and basically how to prepare both physically and mentally for a career in Special Forces?
Yeah, look, there's tons of information about how to prepare physically, and if you're going to do an SF selection, there's an awesome program. The last time I saw it was written by Dan Cooper, who's just done his PhD in all that stuff, so knows what he's talking about. So he's revised that, updated it, and again, I don't know if it's still the current one, but that is a pretty good program. Don't do too much more, don't do too much less. But believe it or not, the physical part's usually pretty easy. Concentrate on that cognitive piece. There's plenty of people out there that can do it physically, but having the right mindset and the EQ, I suppose, to manage that is where I'd spend most of my time understanding that, because you will get that continually throughout your career if you get through selection. That's something that everyone's always looking for. So, you know, your fitness will come and go, your injuries, you know, for whatever reason, you can, if you do it properly, you can get it back. But it's definitely that cognitive piece that will stand you in good stead.
Absolutely. And looking back now, mate, we're getting close to Anzac Day is tomorrow. You served with some amazing guys throughout the regiment, and you've lost a lot of guys from the 96 disaster right through training accidents, the 5 guys in Afghanistan. How do you reflect on all of these guys, not just on Anzac Day, but it's a daily occurrence, isn't it?
Yeah, mate, yeah. And you and I were chatting about this offline for a little while, but it's something that sort of floats into my mind, or there's something that reminds me pretty much daily about the sacrifice those individuals have made, but also their family, and we've touched on that a fair bit. So, yeah, look, there's probably not one day that goes by where something spikes a memory or a feeling or something like that where, you know, you just sort of think, you know, Australia has its freedom, you know, we're going back generations now, but to be able to have a say, to be able to vote, to be able to live in a country like this, you know, is nothing short of spectacular. So, yeah, I think about it all the time, man.
When, as you say, mate, when people whinge about how bad it is in this country, you've seen it firsthand that how shit it is in other countries, and you've been in some third world shit countries.
Yes,
and
I certainly have.
Yeah, we don't have bombs going off, and we really don't know that we are alive and how lucky we are to be here in this beautiful country.
That's why you got to go and test yourself every now and again, mate, as you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, remind yourself that you're alive and you live in a great place.
Absolutely. And, mate, how do people get in contact with you if they want to reach out through the documentary, or they want to talk to you about transitioning into the corporate world, or how do they get in touch with you?
Yeah, interestingly enough, the company I work for, we do veterans recruitment. But look, a couple of years ago I never had a social media profile, and now I do. I'm still trying to work that one out. But yeah, just something you weren't allowed to have. But yeah, look, you can look me up through the company website. Yeah, or jump on some of the socials, you know.
We'll put all the links in
there.
Yeah,
for sure. Notes, and then, the Wandering Warriors will get you through to Eventbrite, which is running the documentary, and there's some direct links there. I'd love for people to make some more donations. We've still got a little way to go to continue that on and get it to where we want it to be. But again, so far, fantastic support. And then, from that perspective, Wandering Warriors, like, we want them to be the beneficiary of any additional funds that comes in. So, so either through that website or the company website that you mentioned, ERS, you can don't email me crap. But any of those mechanisms. Mate.
Yeah, nice. And mate, what are your plans going forward for you and your family now? Like, what do you want to do now? You've got your career outside of the military, and what are your plans going forward?
I'd love to slow down, mate, but it's not happening. So my goal at the moment is to get to a 4-day week, but just so I can have a long weekend every day. But every weekend. But no, look, definitely just enjoying life, mate. Getting out, finding out all those things I didn't get an opportunity to do in the military.
Yep.
There's a whole other life out there. When you find you're sort of committed to one lifestyle, you miss a lot of other elements of, and even just something as simple as Perth. I just realised how much time was spent in Swanbourne, or how much time was spent away.
Yep.
And, just almost rediscovering Perth. But still love to travel.
You got a beautiful partner as well.
Yep. So it's going on nearly 4 years now. So working all that out, mate, and then just trying to help people where I can. I still love the teaching piece, so I still go out and help a lot of our government agency friends. That'll have me run some training, again, sort of same stuff we did in the military, but for those other agencies, just helping them improve training where I can. So love doing that, passionate about that.
And I think, mate, you've earned the right to enjoy after 33 years of service to your country, I think you've earned the right to, as you say, try and slow down, but it's not.
Tiff keeps reminding me of that. So.
Yeah, that's right, mate. So, and mate, as I say, it's just been, what a story of
it's just true grit, determination, succeeding at the elite level. And I want to thank you, mate, for what you've done for veterans, what you continue to do for veterans, and just thank you for coming on True Blue Conversations and sharing your story.
Pleasure, and thanks for having me, mate.
No, it's been a privilege, mate, absolutely. So thank you.
Cheers, mate.
Welcome, loyal listeners of True Blue Conversations. Today's episode is proudly sponsored by Australian Warfighter Coffee. Veteran owned and run, driven by a simple yet powerful motto: people over profit. Every dollar goes towards supporting veterans and first responder charity groups. Head on over to AustralianWarfighters.com and use the code TRUEBLUE for your exclusive discount. Because let's face it, any other coffee is just brown sadness water. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of True Blue Conversations with your host, Adam Bloom. See you on the front line.